The events of the story begin at an ordinary time. Some unusual event happens in the world. Everything around is covered with a dark fog. Even the people in space began to notice the fact that the black fog was enveloping the planet more and more. As it turned out, it was a revival of the essence of evil that had been in preparation for hundreds of years, while all the people lived in obsession. In other words, it could be described as the fact that a mysterious deity had returned to the human world once again. A certain princess-like girl was watching all this on the doorstep of the castle, looking at the moon like a mirror. As a child, a boy named Richard notices something that strikes him once, and immediately for life. That day he noticed a man who became his hero for the rest of his life, for he stood up against this evil. In the very world of our story, monsters have appeared that previously could only be heard of in myths and legends. And high above the moon, looking down on our earth, stands the god of observation who watches everything that happens. Some people decided to fight against this evil and came out to fight monsters and other evil that began to inhabit the world. They began to band together and match their strength against the monsters, say they were to be destroyed. A lonely man standing in this world and smoking a cigarette turns to someone and talks about being envious of him. He tells us that he's been waiting for Monsters Awakening for a long time, but now he's in his 40s and has little time to spare. The man approached a guy named Oscar and told him to put his energies into protecting others. The bloodied man began to walk away and talk about how he would of course accept any choice this guy made. But as he's leaving at the end, he adds that Oscar has excellent sword skills. Recalling Oscar's battle against the monsters, the man says that Ronald is capable of leading a lot of people behind him. In the world of our story, at this point in time, everyone is only trying to protect their family and their home, as well as your teammates who fight together against evil monsters, and also to protect their classmates, with whom together they are learning every day, preparing for this difficult world. Thus, altogether, these people form one organization, the name of which is the Night Watch. Many people have their own special fighting techniques. For example, a male smoker, it's the Shining Moon technique. A girl named Susie has this Phoenix dance technique, which is very effective in combat and defense. A kid named Jimmy also has his own technique, and his name is the Hand of the God of Death. The events of the story take us to a certain man sitting in an armchair who answers positively to the question of whether he was looking for Seraphima. Looking at the chairman in the chair, he talks about joining the Night Watch for exactly 10 years and then leaving. A boy named Michael replies to the chairman saying that he knows all the laws and duties of the Night Watch perfectly well. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to one of the apparently gods who stands all shrouded in water. Opposite him stands one of the Night Watch warriors who speaks of recognizing him immediately, the god Poseidon. Poseidon starts yelling at him saying that this country has no manners at all in addressing its gods. The enormous Poseidon points his weapon at the warrior of the Night Watch and tells him that he will not be able to stand. However, who fights against him immediately suggests that he will succeed. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us, some group of warriors, a god hovering above them saying that they have lost. One of the defeated warriors picks up the amulet and starts talking about life and death in the name of combat. It screams that the heroes who have fallen in the name of humanity will never be forgotten and will fulfill their goals. However, Michael appears nearby and says that the situation seems to have reached a critical level. Immediately afterward, right behind Michael's back, a whole group of people appear standing around him ready to attack. It's hard to even call it a group, because it's more like a whole armed crowd, which is like an army demolishing everything in its path. Ronald turns to God with a cold-blooded stare and talks about what prohibits them from being on their planet. The events of our story take us to a guy named Oscar who is slowly climbing up some stairs somewhere. Looking at the big temple, he talks about how he is always not happy to be here because he has bad memories. As he enters the gates of the abandoned temple, he talks about how he always dreams about the place in a negative way. As he looks at the huge castle, he knocks on the gate and talks about how he is only able to knock on that gate throughout the dream. In the moment, he wakes up and it's all a dream he's had again, once again. At one point, he goes to a mirror and talks about seeing the world completely differently lately and blindfolds his eyes. Going down the stairs to the kitchen, he reflects on the fact that with those blindfolds and feels different. In the moment ahead is his mom, who turns to him and tells him that the doctor is waiting to see him for a checkup and he should go faster. The doctor turns to Oscar and asks him to tell him more about an incident from 10 years ago, after which he went blind. Oscar tells about how one night, 10 years ago, he was just looking at the moon and admiring it intensely. However, in a moment near the moon, Oscar saw an angel that stood all alone, shrouded in a golden aura. Remembering all this now, Oscar also adds that this angel had 6 golden wings. Turning to the doctor, Oscar talks about how his eyes have not opened again since that day. However, in the moment Oscar turns to the doctor, they say that he realizes that it was all just a fantasy, and this surprises the doctor. The doctor starts to walk away and talks about how Oscar's medical history is fully recorded, and there is nothing surprising about it. Our hero Oscar is having lunch with his brother, discussing his eyesight, and they talk about how sometimes it gets better. Oscar's mom talks about finalizing the papers for another school and clarifies if that's what her son wants. By covering his face, Oscar is saying that his eyes will return to their former state and he needs to be around his peers. However, while alone in his room, taking off the blindfold, Oscar realizes that his sight will not return. Oscar realizes he's hiding one important factor because he can actually see some things around him. Oscar feels like an observer in a huge city. Every day he sees a few centimeters further away. This distance is greater and greater. Oscar realizes that at this point he can see already at a distance of 10 meters, and in fact such a person cannot be blind. However, trying to look again at the moon, Oscar realizes that these 10 meters are not enough for him at all. He also ponders every day whether that same angel is watching him from heaven, and whether to follow his actions. Oscar starts closing the windows and talking about going to bed early tonight, because he wants to dream about knocking on that gate again. Meanwhile, the events of our story take us to the battle of the night watched somewhere in the expanse of the city. One of the girls in the squad calls an old man named Billy, who immediately takes the cue and uses a forbidden technique. Billy slaps his hand on the ground and a huge red aura appears and covers everything around him. The aura turns out to be so huge that it rises up like rays of sunlight, however, is completely red. All this aura is seen by the monsters who fight against the Night Watch, and such actions clearly do not please them. One of the girls of the squad named Jessica addresses the monsters, saying that they will never get out of this aura no matter how much they try. She takes her blade in her hands, bends it downward, and speaks about how the fun part is about to begin. Meanwhile, our hero Oscar arrives at the high school and immediately surprises the girls around him with his pleasant appearance. He realizes that it is only his first day of high school, but he is very serious. Talk about being ready for anything. Meanwhile, the teacher at the school in question asks all classmates to welcome Oscar. The teacher sweetly welcomes Oscar to the class, but he realizes that difficulties await him because he has found himself in school in the middle of the semester. One of his classmates immediately approaches Oscar and offers to help him by walking him to his workstation. Surprisingly for Oscar, all the other classmates also show great consideration offering to help. Time marches on and classes are coming to an end, and all the classmates around Oscar ask him to tell a story about his eyes. Oscar's blonde classmate named Laura offers her help, saying that she can always introduce her to everyone. In the moment, our hero Oscar turns to his classmates, asking them why they are so kind to him. Laura starts talking about how some part of Oscar's biography they know from the teacher of the class. Another classmate interrupts Laura to tell her that Oscar's aunt came to their school just a short time ago. He describes everything that happened that day, talk about Oscar's aunt giving everyone candy. Laura stands next to her and chews her candy with a disgruntled look at their mutual classmate, and Oscar finally figures it out. From that moment, Oscar begins to study much more seriously, because he does not want to disappoint his aunt who tried very hard for him. In their class right now, they're just going over the terrible dark fog that's on the planet right now. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to a night squad that is fighting against monsters at this time. The Night Watch squad, under Jessica's orders, begins fighting monsters in critical mode, leaving no one alive. Jessica also uses very strong techniques, channeling the full power of her attacks directly into her opponents. Along with her, the other members of the squad are also active, sending the monsters away with sharp swings. Jessica fights pretty relaxed and talks about all you them opponents of their level, and it'll be resolved pretty quickly. However, in a moment right behind Jessica, a huge monster appears and looks down at her as if preparing to attack. And so it goes, the moment the monster scrambles through her body with its huge horn and bones. The guys on Jessica's squad are just in wild shock. They can't believe what just came in. Jessica falls to the floor in blood and unable to do anything. reports that the operation has ended in failure. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to Oscar and his classmates walking down the street and chatting about monster myths. Oscar stops in a moment and starts trying to figure out if there really is an odor of monster corpses. A few guys look into the tunnel and talk about how after Oscar's words, it really did feel like there were monsters in here. At one point, our guys do discover a monster who starts yelling at them and kills some girl. At the moment, all the guys start running away, including our hero Oscar. However, he is haunted by some unexplainable feeling. Even without seeing the monster, our hero Oscar senses its presence and that it is very close by. In the moment, classmate Laura throws her backpack backwards right towards the monster and our hero Oscar. However, much to his delight, our hero Oscar dodges this and thrusts forward from the monster. Almost running out of the tunnel, our hero Oscar feels that there is another monster ahead. Oscar realizes he has no choice but to fight, so he attacks one of these monsters. Oscar's punch turns out to be pretty strong, like he's a pro night watchman. One monster defeats another, and he brings our hero Oscar to a dead end right around everyone. Immediately after which the monster left behind abruptly snaps out of his seat and thrusts right at Oscar, prepare to kill him. At this point, Oscar is very sad that this is all happening to him. He starts to remember his childhood and how he was afraid of monsters, gets violently angry and starts screaming, creating an aura of energy. At that moment, some sharp charge of energy flies straight through space, heading through the stars. At this attention is the same girl angel who is near the moon and watches over the earth. Meanwhile, the aura around our hero Oscar becomes 10 times larger and envelops everything around him. Our hero's eyes are covered in yellow energy, and lightning bolts of residue emanate from his body around him. The very aura that Oscar created reaches enormous proportions and stretches across the city. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to an old man named Billy who is running around town talking to someone on the phone. A squad member reports to him with the information that the operation has failed, and one of the squad members is now badly injured. Billy is rather disappointed with this information. He asks about where the monsters ran to and how many there were. Billy talks about dealing with them, but the dialogue is interrupted by the fact that he sees a huge aura of energy ahead. Billy begins to suspect that this may be the birth of the Forbidden Rune, and it is a very interesting event. Looking at this, Billy also talks about how the power of a person with this kind of energy exceeds all 5 realms. Meanwhile, in one of the research buildings, they also notice this burst of energy that Oscar created. One of the squad members reflects that this energy is more like the power of a god than the power of a sphere. Meanwhile, our hero Oscar changes his appearance. He becomes more like a god who presents himself as the king of all gods. It's like Oscar's mind has changed. He talks about finally getting a physical body for the past 10 years. Our hero Oscar also notices that now he sees everything at a distance, much more than before the meeting with the monster. He also realizes that all those previously forgotten feelings have returned to him, and the flow of energy in his body is tremendous. The monsters at this point also start to act up. They gather in a bunch, and one of them jumps right towards Oscar. At this moment, it's as if a god appears behind our hero Oscar, created from his aura of great power. Oscar at this moment takes an ordinary iron weapon, envelops it with his aura, and then jumps and strikes the monster. With great ease, Oscar gets rid of monsters like common trash early on in just one hit. Oscar attacks each of these monsters time after time, sending them aside like normal junk in his path. However, in a moment, he begins to feel the pain in his body that feels as if it is restraining him again. She does not let him move, and Oscar himself also realizes that he has almost no strength left to move. At this point, the bridge decides they found the best moment to launch an attack directly at Oscar. In the moment, Oscar realizes that this could all be his finale, as he has no strength to resist the monster. However, someone's huge red-colored blade appears to the side and dramatically displays its aura. Immediately afterwards, this blade is used to deliver a huge blow that crushes all monsters around it and adds red energy. It turns out to be some man in a cloak. He becomes right in front of the speeder and protects him with his body, not letting the monsters pass. It turns out already known to us Old Man Billy, who saves Oscar and takes out the remaining monsters. His attacks are very strong and massive. He crumbles everything in his path and using red-colored energy with black elements. Old Billy takes out his cigarette and starts smoking. He asks Oscar who he is and contacts his squad. In the moment, Old Man Billy walks forward and asks Oscar if he likes it. but our hero doesn't understand what he's talking about. Strip Billy asks our hero again, ending his question by talking about whether he likes his knife. Billy addresses Oscar with a smile, about how if he likes him, Oscar can join them and then Billy will give it to him. However, our hero Oscar just turns away. They say that it does not interest him, and this even greatly surprises old Billy. With a rather cold-blooded look, Oscar looks at the old man and says that if he joins them, he might die. However, old man Billy hugs Oscar in response, saying that they should talk more and work things out between themselves. In response, Oscar says that of course he believes old Billy, but asks him to let him go, because he needs to pick up his books in his backpack that fell down. Immediately afterward, old Billy lets our hero go and tells him to come back again. Our hero began to leave, and old Billy looked after him, and realized that even using all his strength for the night, he could not match Oscar. Oscar comes home. His brother asks why he came home so late, but he replies that there was a lot of studying to do today. Oscar asks his brother if he has done his homework. Then he shows his notebook and says that he has solved everything. Oscar goes to his room and says that he is very tired today and will go to bed, and recommends the same to his brother. However, the way to his room, Oscar keeps sticking to the wall, almost falling to the floor. This is noticed by his brother and is greatly surprised. Oscar's brother asks if everything is fine and all right. He replies that everything is fine and wishes his brother good night. He reciprocates. In the moment, Oscar's brother turns to his cat and asks if the cat has a strange odor from Oscar's body today. Looking after his brother who is leaving, he says that Oscar is walking today with a very strange smell of blood. Meanwhile, with very slow and uncertain movements, Oscar makes his way to his room and sharply closes the door. Oscar collapses on his bed and immediately begins to reflect on everything that has happened in just one day after transferring to a new school. Oscar begins to remember the very state he felt when he started to fight against the monsters. Now, lying on his bed, Oscar is thinking about how he doesn't want to be any kind of hero. All he wants to do is just protect his family. Meanwhile, Oscar falls asleep and goes into his usual dream, where he finds himself back at some castle. He walks up to that same magical huge door and realizes that today he will have to knock on it again. However, today something strange happens. After the first knock, there are strange lightning bolts of energy. In a moment, Oscar notices that the door began to move from the place and begins to sharply push it. I try to open it. More lightning bolts appear all around, and the door itself does open abruptly right towards Oscar. Some kind of dark energy appears from there, and a rather creepy aura. Oscar is standing right in front of the entrance. Immediately afterwards, Oscar decides that he should go inside and slowly walks forward. Oscar walks around the dark and cold castle, picks up that this is the moment he's been seeking for a full 5 years. He realizes that this castle reminds him of a mental hospital, and he gets the full feeling that he's been here before. He continues to walk further around the castle, noticing more and more similarities to the arrangement of the mental hospital. However, at the same time, while watching all the new corridors, he notices moments that are very different and realizes that this is not the same place. At a point, he notices a strange door that leads into the unknown and is outlined with different symbols around it. Thinks that this door might lead to something very interesting and decides to open it to see. The door starts to open and it scares the hell out of Oscar. He never expected this to happen. In a moment, he also notices that all of the symbols on the door have begun to be covered in purple aura rays. In a moment, a huge and sharp glow begins to cover everything around, eclipsing all the darkness around with strong as if sun rays. However, trailing rays disappear, and in the room itself, Oscar sees a certain girl who is sitting on a bed with her face down. Oscar starts looking straight in her direction, realizing that she looks pretty sad, and trying to understand everything around her. Some unknown girl at this point doesn't even lift her head, still looking down without noticing Oscar. At the moment, Oscar is about to address it, however notices the system tables with information appearing in the sky. Oscar comes closer and examines them, learning that the girl's name is Anfisa, and she is sick, so she needs help right away. From these same system windows, our hero learns that one is one of the 5 goddesses and suffers from a psychological illness. However, our hero Oscar doesn't understand at all how he can help her and cure her mental illness. In a very confident moment, Oscar abruptly begins to address her and ask if she can hear him. However, in response, she only starts screaming, talking about a certain child, which surprises Oscar very much. Oscar starts looking straight into her face, not sure why one of the goddesses is speaking a language unknown to him. In the moment, Anfisa starts crying, blushing, reaching out to Oscar, and talking about finally finding him, her baby. This whole thing even scares you and surprises Oscar. He just can't believe what she's about to say. Oscar seems to be caught in his own mind where he sees this girl, realizing that his whole life he has been raised by his aunt, not his birth parents. At this point, Anfisa snaps out of it. She heads over to Oscar and talks about him being her son. Anfisa runs straight at our hero, but in the moment passes through him, traversing his body like a ghost. Instead, Anfisa simply grabs a nearby vase and hugs it. She hero is in wild surprise. Immediately afterwards, our hero Oscar wakes up and realizes that all of this was once again in his dream, and nothing more. Oscar immediately grabs his head and surprisingly starts thinking about what he should remake with this Anfisa in the castle. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to old Billy, who talks about coming to the very school where someone is hiding. That day, one of the night review analysts reported that Oscar should be urgently intercepted before he was picked up by guys from another organization. Standing outside the school now, old Billy analyzes all that is now known and realizes that losing Oscar is not a pleasant situation for him. In the moment, old Billy starts yelling at school security and asking them if Oscar is still in class or not. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to one of the local hospitals, a rather advanced one. Inside the hospital, Oscar is sitting with the doctor. Oscar tells him a story about Anfisa and his dreams, who cries all the time. The doctor at this point, according to Oscar's description, is making a medical chart, writing down all the notes there. Oscar continues his dialogue with the doctor. He doesn't talk about how it's all from dreams. He explains it as if he has a girlfriend like that. Oscar tells the doctor that his girlfriend cannot be hospitalized, whereupon the doctor prescribes the right medication. Some time passes as Oscar trashes around the street with the medication in his hands, wondering if he can give it to Anfisa. However, the moment is walking down the street, right in front of him, he notices old Billy looking right at him. Old Billy starts asking Oscar where Oscar has been all day, because he's been waiting for him right under the school since 6 a.m., all the way through the evening. In response to everything old Billy says, Oscar just abruptly starts running away, realizing that he doesn't want to see him. However, even though Oscar runs quite fast and sharp, old Billy, of course, overtakes him in just a blink of an eye. The old man gets right in front of Oscar, sharply pushes him against the wall, holds his arms back, and tells him that he'd better not run away. Oscar is very surprised and starts threatening old Billy that he is going to start shouting loudly and call all the people here. Old man Oscar's not to pretend as if he does not understand or know anything, because everything happened recently. Immediately afterward, old Billy grabs Oscar, starts leading him around, and talking about how they're going to have a serious conversation. Some time passes. Not on the hero together with the old man comes the right point, which was marked by Old Man Billy. These places turn out to be a love hotel. Old Man Billy talks about how they urgently need to go to this place. This scares Oscar a lot. Oscar starts to fall to the floor from shock, screaming about how he doesn't want to go there. They don't need to go there at all. However, despite everything Oscar says, Old Man Billy winds up at the hotel and talks about needing a room for two urgently. After a while, our hero Oscar, the historian Billy together go up to the right floor and sharply open the door of the room. Whereupon old Billy abruptly grabs our hero Oscar and throws him right onto the nearest bed. Old Man Billy starts with a high view of our hero and forgives him for answering questions quickly and truthfully. Oscar then asks a direct question about how our hero is related to King Michael the Angel. Meanwhile, the events of our story take us back to September a century ago. A certain group of explorers were traveling through abandoned mines in search of something new, and one day they managed to stumble upon a Leviathan dragon that belonged to the house class. Then all the researchers fell to the floor from shock and fright, because it was the first time in the world when people saw mythical creatures. Information about it was received by the highest-ranking people in the world, who decided to hide information about mythical creatures. Next, old Billy tells our hero that the King of Angels, whom Oscar saw, was the third mythical creature. All this scares the hell out of our hero. He could not believe that everything is actually so confusing and complicated. In March of that same year, a century ago, another very extraordinary incident occurred. A huge beam bounced off the moon and headed toward Earth, hitting right in the region of South America. Research teams immediately went to the site, but it was obvious that there were also moon gods. The researchers continued their endeavor, trying to find at least some leads for information, but it was very difficult to do so. One of the explorers descended to the depths of the volcano and spotted a real god sealed in the depths of the volcano who was given the fourth code. After a time after all the incidents, scientists began to notice that children born near the incident began to show unexplained abilities. Old Billy explains to our hero that they all had many similarities, but the most important thing is that they were divorced stronger than humans. Old Billy also explains the fact that yesterday's yellow light and energy was an awakening of the mysterious rums. In the moment, our hero Oscar reached his hand up and began to move it to the side, to determine if it was real or if he was even there at all. After all the stories of Old Billy, our hero realized what happened to him yesterday and became one step closer to the truth. Old Billy continued to explain, saying that depending on the received power and energy of a person, their strength is divided into levels. The first level is the first realm. It has so little power that all of it fits in an ordinary pond. The second realm is already much stronger, the power in it bubbling like flowing channels and straits at high speed. The third realm gives even more power and can be compared to the ability to flood an entire world ocean. Next comes the fourth realm, whose power allows you to influence space but still measure it. And the fifth realm, a power that cannot be measured or calculated, giving the ability to change space. Old Billy explains that the power of the sixth realm is so great that it is simply immeasurable even by the cosmos. All these words very much pleases our hero. He immediately turns to Old Billy and asks in which of the kingdoms is out. Old Billy answers our hero that he is the first kingdom, and his power is a little more than that of an ordinary man. Hearing these words, our hero realizes that most likely the fact that he was able to open the gate in his dream is a breakthrough into spiritual space. Immediately afterward, our hero turns to Old Billy and asks what level of realms he himself is on. Quite unsure, but Old Billy replies that he has no spiritual power at all, much to our hero's surprise. Our hero asks Old Billy how he fights monsters without spiritual power. The latter replies that he relies on fighting skills. Immediately afterwards, Stabilitas begins to tell our hero about ways to awaken forbidden rums. The first way our hero already knows, and the second way is the usual purchase of these rums on the prohibited market. And the third way is to get power directly from a god. Sometimes they give their power to someone who sympathizes with them. People who have received their power directly from one of the gods are more likely to align themselves with them and obey their orders. More often than not, such people turn out to be evil and end up continuing the faith and power of evil gods against ordinary people. Immediately after the explanation, Old Billy turns to our hero and asks him about what the king of the gods told him when he became possessed. Our hero, in response the old man killed, claimed that the king of all gods named Michael absolutely nothing to him. Immediately afterward, Old Billy began to speculate about what King Michael's intentions are, for as they know he is on the neutral side. Our hero Oscar began to declare that he was not interested in Michael's plans, because he was not going to participate in them, whatever there was. After that, Oscar got up and said that if that was the end of it, he was going to go home. This greatly surprised Old Billy. He began to ask Oscar if he was not interested in what organization they all work for. Our hero started talking about how if he knew more information, he'd probably be tried for assassination, and he doesn't want that. Immediately after that, our hero agrees to listen to the stories of Old Billy, and he began to tell with the transfer of documents. He started talking about how after finding the first mythical creature, people created a separate special group to deal with it. From that moment on, people began to observe more and more mythical creatures, so the group improved their skills and practiced every day. A great deal of time passed from that point on, and soon this group evolved into an organization called the Night Watch. Old Billy took great pride in telling the details of their organization, saying that their main duty was to protect the people. Immediately thereafter, Old Billy became intensely fond of it, his eyes burning with the idea of calling our hero into the organization. Our hero Oscar agreed that their organization was wonderful, but he refused the offer to join. Looking at the moon, our hero began to tell Old Billy about his family and the rather heavy history they are going through. Our hero Oscar began to talk rather harshly about how he wants to always be there for his family and protect only them. And finally, just now, when his eyes have returned to normal and he can put his best foot forward, he wants to do it. So in response to old Billy's words, our hero declares that he always wants to be around his family and protect them. Old Billy exhales sharply in response and suggests that he probably had too small an opinion of Oscar. Immediately afterward, our hero Oscar began to walk away and talk about how he was grateful for the information and wasn't going to tell it. The events of the story take us forward. He returns home and begins to change his clothes, reflecting on all that has happened. However, in a moment on his desk, he notices a certain item that clearly wasn't in his classroom before. It turns out to be a small talisman with the name of that old man Billy. Our hero immediately realizes who it belongs to. Examining it from the other side of the party on the hero, notices inscriptions with noble words and an oath to protect all. Meanwhile, the events of our story take us into the dream of Oscar, who decides to start Anfisa's treatment. However, he does it rather poorly, studying the books that are available and trying to find some information. Our hero is studying mythology, which has information about the goddess Anfisa and her 20 children. He is trying to find a clue here. Our hero merely watches as she sits surrounded by various objects and considers them as her children. Anfisa hugs one of the vases and says that her brother will be back soon. Anfisa sits back and further ponders that when her children return, she should get into the detailed work of raising them. However, in the moment, she starts crying again, saying that she has been waiting for them for 3,000 years. Our hero Oscar stands beside her and ponders the fact that she looks pretty pathetic for a goddess with the strongest children. In the moment, our hero abruptly realizes something. In his thoughts, he says that he has apparently figured out how he can help. Right after a new idea comes to our hero's mind, he heads straight to Anfisa. In the moment, our hero decides that if Anfisa sees her children in everything, he can try to create the illusion that he is her child. In the moment, our hero starts hugging her and talking in her ear about him being her baby, and he lugs, she abruptly starts crying. In the moment, Anfisa throws all things on the floor, sharply hugs and strokes our hero. They say that they are glad to see him. In the moment they continue the hug, the system reports that our hero has completed the task at 3%. This makes our hero very happy, because at last he finally achieved at least some success after so long. Our hero continues his strong embrace with Anfisa, and afterward tries to find a new notification from the system. The system reports that our hero randomly receives one of Anfisa's abilities as a prize. Our hero gets the Night Star Dance ability. It's not the coolest ability, but it's better than nothing. In the moment, Anfisa reaches forward with one of the buckets and tells our hero that this is one of his favorite dishes. However, all Oscar sees is that a huge energy charge has appeared around the plate of food, floating in the air. Immediately afterwards, our hero reaches out his hand to this energy, thus trying to absorb all of it. Wrapping himself in the energy of a nearby person, our hero Oscar feels as if this energy is transforming his body. In the moment, he feels like a sorcerer from a magic game who has accessed energy powers. At this point, our hero immediately realizes that all that he has gained separates him from the world of men. This all makes Oscar very happy, because with this energy he feels he can protect his entire family. In the moment, Anfisa holds out a flask of medicine to our hero. They say that this is Oscar's brother, and he missed him very much. Our hero, of course, pretends like it's all true and starts pushing this flask into the ground with tremendous force. Immediately after which the flask becomes gigantic in size, our hero informs Anfisa that he will be back a little later, and leaves. Heading further down the corridor, our hero Oscar goes to a certain room and abruptly opens the entrance to it. However, our hero's dream ends, and the events of the story take us back to his home on a sunny morning. Our hero notices that his aunt is going to work early today. He wonders why this is so. She replies that there will be a lot of work today. However, in a moment, but the character Oscar just abruptly stands there in shock. He watches his aunt and is very surprised. And in a moment, he abruptly lowers his head and begins wiping his eyes, repeating the motion with his hands time after time. The moment she says goodbye to her aunt by shaking off her fist, which also surprises her in one moment. Oscar's aunt turns around and our hero announces that he has finally started to see more or less well, which shocks her dramatically. Such abrupt and rather happy news could not help but bring her to tears. The aunt begins to cry and look at her nephew. She immediately abruptly runs up to Oscar and starts hugging him and holding onto his shoulders, realizing that this is just fine. Aunt Oscar cries on his shoulders, while our hero himself smiles and realizes that he was finally able to bring some happiness into her life. Oscar's younger brother also hears all this. He abruptly runs up and immediately starts cheering for his brother, saying that this is just fine. Meanwhile, the events of the story takes us to school. The girls around us notice the changes in Oscar, and it makes them happy as well. However, he notices that not all of his classmates make it look that way. Some of them didn't even pay attention to him coming to class. However, his attention is still taken by girls who ask how he was able to heal so quickly. Oscar has nothing to say except that he came back from the hospital yesterday and was treated well there. The events of the story take us a bit forward, with several classmates apologizing to Oscar saying they dumped him yesterday. However, in response with only a bloodied face asking them all to stop apologizing and saying anything already, Oscar begins to say that such behavior is inherent in people and there is nothing wrong with it, and he holds no grudges at all. One of the guys starts talking about how after the whole incident, people from the organization came to see him, offering to join him. Another guy there abruptly declares that he's in general agreement to join them and wants to. He says that it is the desire of every man to fight against his enemies and not to live a dull life. One who soon calms him down is told that he could die at any moment and is not that strong. Oscar says he's the one who can die without even leaving anything behind, and then he walks away and a strong wind begins to blow outside. Oscar is well aware that following such a strong wind, it is likely to start raining quite heavily, so he heads back to his house. Oscar comes home and immediately walks into the hallway and starts taking his shoes off, talking about how he's already back. However, in the moment, he raises his head sharply and is very much surprised at what is now in view in front of him. He notices the same old Billy sitting in the kitchen at their shared table drinking coffee. Oscar immediately turns to him and asks how he was able to find him, since he didn't know where Oscar lived. Old Billy explains that the same amulet he left in Oscar's pocket has a GPS navigator. Oscar listens to him and silently walks away, repeating that he has no intention of joining anyone. Old Billy talks about how he's here for a different issue now and puts a wad of large amounts of money on the table. Oscar turns to him and asks about what it all means now and why he needs so much money. In response, however, Old Billy pulls out a pack of cigarettes with a lighter and asks Oscar if he minds if he smokes. Our hero, however, abruptly begins to shout that he objects and smoking in his house is not necessary at all, which surprises Old Billy. After that, Old Billy began to tell his past. He started to say that his father died when he was only 6 years old. And Old Billy's mother at this point was working 2 jobs, but still not enough money. All this made little Billy very sad at the time, for he understood and saw the whole situation very well. Time passed. Billy grew up and in school he got the best grades. He was an excellent student among all. However, despite this, every time he went to school, he still thought about the fact that in his life he would dream of becoming a soldier. One day he fulfilled his dream. His mom didn't say anything, just saw him off with a look and cried near the door. At that point, it was very hard for Billy to leave and also put his mom here alone, but he made the decision nonetheless. After a time, he transferred to the military corps and realized that he made the right decision, because to become stronger, it was worth it to discard everything that was. Then lying on his bed in the military corps, he decided that he would get the best medals and uniforms, and with it all he would come home. He continued his story to our hero, talk about later got into the special forces, and his promotion accelerated. He began to tell our hero that after he was sent to the night watch, but all these stories apparently tired Oscar. Once Old Billy wanted to leave the service and go to his native village to help his mother with everything, but now it is impossible. Displaying his night watch medal, he talks about joining them. He can no longer leave the service so soon. Afterward, Old Man Billy addresses Oscar, talking about how he is different and has chosen to go along with his family back home. Turning to Oscar again, Old Billy talks about using the money to buy something for his family, but Oscar refuses. Oscar starts to put the money back in Billy's hands, talking about how they don't need the money at all, and they can handle it themselves. Immediately afterward, Oscar started talking about how his aunt would not agree to take the money either, so it was not needed at all. He talks about how they don't need the money that Old Billy earned by risking his life, and it's all very surprising to him. Immediately afterward, Oscar declares that his sight has returned, which is why he now has the opportunity to start working for his family on his own. Billy then stands up and says that Oscar is very stubborn, but he also does not intend to insist in such a case. Oscar and Old Billy go outside. Billy suggests that there is no need to see him off at all and directs Oscar to go home. Leaving the old man wishes our hero a wonderful future, and the latter in return wishes Billy a wonderful soldiering service. Immediately afterward, old Billy leaves in the rain through the sad, gloomy street corridors. Going to one cafe and sitting down at a table, not even covered from the rain, he sits and considers something. However, in the moment the old man is killed, receives a sharp phone call informing him that they have had an emergency. Old Billy is informed that the Ghost King is about to arrive quite soon. Billy abruptly jumps up from his seat and is very surprised. One of the squad's agents reports that they have stumbled upon the blood of a Ghost King at a location in the city. An agent of the Night Watch squad, reporting to either the Old City Division or directly to the New City Division. Immediately afterward, the agent also adds that Billy's task at the moment is to evacuate people from the Old Town area. He is also informed that Jessica has been sent to him as a reinforcement. Billy is surprised because she was wounded a while ago. Meanwhile, the rest of the squad is evacuating people from the new city, but there are problems because there are so many people. Snipers are watching, reporting what happened. They discuss the fact that the consequences could be catastrophic. Prebili is surprised very much at the plan, for the enemy want to drive him into the old city and fight him where there are fewer people. Old Billy is also warned that if he sees the despicable king, it is not a good idea to fight him, for he is very strong. Billy is asked only to help with evacuation and information, and to pass on whatever he gets, he agrees. Close up from the car, Billy ponders that the plan may not work out, because their opponent is very strong. Immediately after which, Billy starts running along the roof of the building to look for the nearest people in order to evacuate them. Runs by many houses, thinking about what might happen if the battle started right in a residential neighborhood. However, at one point, old Billy abruptly senses some very powerful odor coming from outside. He turns around and realizes that this smell reminds him very much of the stench that comes from the corpses of mystical creatures. In a moment, he notices that some sharp lines of water have started to appear from the puddle and says he's hit the jackpot. Immediately afterward, he reports to his partner about what's behind all the ghostly monster and starts a fight. They try to stop him. However, old Billy realizes that there is no time at all and he should act here and now and no other way. Old Billy starts the battle and the allies are on the phone telling him to cease and desist and urgently. However, Billy says that it is too late to evacuate in any way, so there is only one option left, and that is to fight. Billy's allies talk about how they don't want to lose their men to the Ghost King, so it's best to back off. However, old Billy at this point isn't answering anything at all. He's just tearing down a road sign and getting ready to start his fight. Old Billy starts to peel the paint off the off-road sign. The allies are on the phone telling him that there's no hurry now, but he doesn't listen to them. Old Billy talks about the oath he took to follow, which he is obligated to protect all civilians. Right at that moment as he speaks, the apparently horrible monster appears from behind. And so it happens. Out of a huge stream of water that was rushing upward, appears the face of a monster that looks at old Billy. Billy starts pulling out his blades and talking about going behind his back, and there aren't 1,000 people, but that doesn't mean anything yet. He's getting ready to strike shouts that he still has followers and good people behind him. He talks about how hundreds of young guys, nothing is their fault, and they shouldn't die at the hands of this monster. Immediately afterward, a full-fledged fight begins between the monster and Billy, in which he confronts the mystical creature. A huge aura and energy appears between them that lifts all the water around upwards without even letting the rain pass downwards. In the moment, the old man uses one of his techniques, bound with forbidden runes and a ring attack. He creates a huge chasm right in the concrete floor, then disappears along with the monster in an instant. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to Oscar's house, who is having dinner with his family. Oscar's aunt recommends that his brother eat more, because he's just growing now, he needs more food. Immediately afterward, Oscar's brother listens with his aunt, and starts eating at times faster than before. In a moment, Oscar notices that their cat, who was here a short time ago, has disappeared. One cutlet, Oscar's aunt talks about their cat being at the window and nothing wrong. Oscar walks over to the cat and starts stroking it, asking about seeing something scary. Oscar begins to look down and abruptly notices a road sign that is completely covered in water on all sides. Seeing him, Oscar goes into a wild shock. He is very much surprised, and a cold sweat runs down his face. Oscar begins to run briskly to the door and tells his aunt that he should leave now, and that it is very urgent. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to old Billy, who pulls out his lighter and starts opening it. Immediately afterward, old Billy opens a pack of cigarettes, pulling one out and lighting it right there, starting to smoke. The old man with blood on his face says that he didn't think the monster would get to him so quickly. Monster, his turn, stands next to him and looks directly at the old man and just stares silently with his mystical eyes. Immediately afterward, the old man turns to the monster and says that he could not have imagined that he was so strong. Billy turns to the monster and talks about how apparently the rainy weather only gets worse around here. The monster gets right on top of Billy, who talks about the monster inflicting a very crushing wound on him. Billy decides to attack the monsters with whatever he has left after their first encounter, and in the moment between them in battle, there is a violent clash between them again. The monster and old man Billy hit each other with direct attacks, dealing quite a bit of damage. Momentum, the old man even manages to repel the monster for a while, resolving its ability to attack. Immediately afterward, Billy decides that this is the best moment to launch another powerful attack. However, he also notices that he doesn't even leave any wounds on the body of this sinister monster with his sword. This doesn't stop Billy at all. In his desire to win, he jumps on the monster again with an attack. Someone in the moment monster launches into a wave of water, then throws our warrior away from himself, preventing him from attacking. Billy spits up blood after the sudden pressure because of the water and talks about how the monster is pretty good at fighting. Billy starts praising him again and talking about how this is a great result for an ordinary mystical creature. The monster at this point snaps out of his seat and begins to bear right down on Bile with a huge charge of energy inside. However, in the moment, our warrior turns his attention to something and is very much surprised in the moment. Old man Billy notices that right around this monster, an ominous aura begins to appear that envelops everything around it. Our hero notices a skull and behind auras right on the floor, realizing it's one due to forbidden ruins that aims to reduce powers. In the moment, Billy also notices that it is an aura and force enveloping him from all sides, preventing him from moving. Old Billy struggles to move around, looking for a better position to get out of the encirclement. However, to put it mildly, he doesn't succeed at all. The monster is waiting for him from the other side. Immediately afterward, with a very powerful blow of his arm, the monster knocks Billy off his feet, preventing him from leaving his surroundings. Immediately afterward, he unleashes another attack of the same kind, thus inflicting more pain on Billy. Our warrior realizes that if this continues, he's going to die pretty quickly, and something needs to be done about it right away. Immediately after making his decision, Billy picks up his blade and begins to hold it back hard, even through the pain. With his blade straight forward and begins to try to stabilize his state, in the moment imagining himself in a state of flux. However, the monster at this moment is not slumbering at all. It sneaks up from behind and prepares to launch a powerful attack. However, old man Billy notices this action well and is already preparing to repel it by carrying a counterattack on his opponent, this monster. In the moment their blows cross each other, Billy's blade striking directly at the monster's powerful charge of energy. Although Billy is thrown back to the side, however, he didn't let the monster defeat himself with one attack. Old Billy starts to let go of his blade, saying that all events are playing against him today and it's pretty sad. Old Billy talks about the fact that it rained pretty tragic today. He smiles and closes an eyes. And in the moment, the old man prepares to attack the enemy monster again, and does afterward, saying that his deception won't work. The old man yells at the monster, saying that the rain won't just fool him, and delivers a powerful blow to the monster's body. The old man again jumps on his opponent, saying that although he has an advantage, but it is unlikely to help him in the fight. The old man's body from wounded, but that doesn't stop him from attacking at all. He jumps a new energy charge and prepares to hit the monster with it. He yells at his opponent, saying that if he had the forbidden rune, he would have died 1,000 times already. Our warrior strikes with his blade, but in a moment he notices that his blade is stuck right in the body of his opponent. Immediately afterward, his opponent strikes back, which throws Billy off to the side away from himself. Our brave warrior, old man Billy, covered in blood, is flying down, realizing that he has almost no strength left to fight any further. Flying down, he reels off many moments of his life, reminiscing about which issued the crest of the Night's Watch. At that time, he was also given a secret item, and using it will lead to the end of his life. However, it will help him a lot. These items in the life of a Night Watch warrior is his name seal, the application of which is only possible in the worst-case scenario. In this fight, old Billy decides that now is the time when he can use her. In a moment, Billy begins to hear his name coming from an ordinary road sign. This surprises him greatly. A road sign asks to open a portal to space and let someone in to help old Billy. Apparently, the person who requests Billy to open up space for him is our hero, Oscar. Using the portal of a road sign, Billy yells at our hero, asking what he's doing here and why he's not having dinner with his family. Billy stands in front of the monster and tells our hero Oscar that he is afraid of death, so it is dangerous to let him in. Oscar yells back that old man Billy is right, of course. However, in a situation like this, he wants the help of a very much brave warrior. Oscar starts beating up the portal and talking about how old Billy really needs help now, because together they will defeat the monster anyway. However, looking at the portal, Billy says that there is only one way to get into the portal: wait for old Billy to die. Hearing this, Oscar becomes very upset. He stands in front of the road sign and realizes he has almost no energy left. Oscar is quite saddened by what is happening. Gritting his teeth, he can't believe that old Billy is about to die. Old Billy notices that Oscar's voice is missing, and apparently he has gone to his house, which is a good thing in Billy's opinion. In the moment, Billy grabs his crest and starts clutching it, saying that he's leaving a message for the entire Night Watch. He lets everyone know that it's time for him to use the power of his coat of arms and seal, so he's going to do it. He cries out that he has waited a very long time for this, for such a strong and sudden burst of strength is exactly what he had dreamed of earlier. A huge red aura begins to envelop Billy around and appear everywhere, filling the space and giving him strength. Billy's surge of strength is noticed even by the monster, who is greatly surprised and screams at one point. Old Billy pulls out his huge blade covered in aura and talks about using the forbidden rune of the shimmering moon. The monster, meanwhile, does not dare to stand still. He runs around the sideshows and prepares to also attack Old Man Billy back to defeat him. However, after such a sharp and strong influx of strength, Billy is not scared of anything at all, and he just starts attacking his opponent. With his first powerful blow, Billy brings down one of the monster's paws, severing it from its body in an instant. It renders the monster's leg, and the monster itself falls powerless to the floor and starts screaming while Billy stands nearby and just stares at it. Billy starts walking right at the monster with a huge force around him, realizing that the monster is like a bug to him now. Billy starts yelling about how this feeling of power is just beautiful, and the person who created the coat of arms and seal is very clever and brilliant. In the moment, Billy creates a huge plot aura out of his energy, squeezing all the monster energy that is around. Immediately afterward, Billy begins to unleash strong and powerful attacks directly towards his opponent with great power. In the moment, with his energy, Billy fills everything around him and covers everything with his ominous red aura. Immediately after, old Billy destroys everything around him, breaking the monster's aura and its protective barrier, breaking through all layers of defense. In the moment, the monster tries to lift and enlarge its paws, but it succeeds clearly with difficulty, for Billy's strength is very great. In the moment, Billy looks directly at his opponent monster with a bloodthirsty smile, realizing that he's getting the upper hand. In the moment, old Billy grasps at his heart and begins to realize that he's in a lot of pain, getting worse by the second. Old Man Billy realizes that time is running out and he should act faster to defeat the enemy. Billy yells for the monster to prepare for its death and abruptly leaps out of his seat, preparing to attack it with a powerful attack. Billy and the monster get off the ground and start running at each other with some pretty powerful attacks, preparing to inflict critical wounds. The monster covers everything around it with its powerful aura and creates an impossible path for Billy to retreat. However, Billy in turn also snaps out of his seat and starts attacking the monster, inflicting huge wounds to the point of bleeding. Immediately afterward, Billy begins to feel that he is feeling pretty bad. He hardly realizes what is going on anymore and prepares for the worst-case scenario. In the moment, the monster snaps out of his seat and wraps his arm around old Billy, squeezing him with tremendous force. This turns out to be critical damage for old Billy, for he did not expect his opponent to be so strong. Immediately afterward, the monster throws our warrior aside with tremendous force, and he flies across the ground. In the moment, Billy manages to stay on the ground and grab the floor with his hands in order to stop his flight. The monster in turn stands in front of Billy and clenches his fist, creating a message to him of his helplessness. However, in the very next instant, Billow's opponent's hands are already covered in a powerful charge of red energy that Billow created. In the moment, the entire arm of Billy's opponent abruptly breaks to blood and begins to ooze from all sides with great force. Billy turns to the monster and talks about how the fight will be different now that they only have one hand each. Billy, meanwhile, realizes that he's stopped feeling pain and it's terrible, but he still has the strength to fight. Billy realizes that as long as his opponent, the Ghost King, is alive, he has no right to die and give up. Billy screams that he can't fall face down, so he will attack and fight to the very end. However, in a moment, old Billy notices a sudden change in space and some new aura around him. It turns out to be our hero, Oscar, who showed up here. He reports that he fixed his gaze into the pillar and the portal opened. Oscar says he stood looking at the sign all the way down until it started to open because it was getting dark. After a while, he felt the power of the god Seraphim begin to help him and exert pressure. Oscar tells old Billy about how it all makes no difference in the big picture because he came here to help him. However, in response, old Billy puts a blade to Oscar's head and tells him to cut the crap. Billy asks Oscar to stay behind his back, but our hero does not agree with this decision. He tries to challenge Oscar's decision. However, in a moment of standing behind us, our hero Oscar abruptly turns his attention to something ahead of him with a great shock. Oscar looks right at Billy's back and notices the huge injuries with the ability and realizes that Billy has a huge problem. Billy turns to the monster and tells it that he is obligated to attack it again with his sword and defeat it faster this time. Billy also announces that he will now make his final cut, after which no help will be needed. Immediately after, old Billy addresses our hero, saying that if he respects him, he will take care of his sword. Billy prepares to attack and talks about how his sword is very beautiful and he would like to keep it. The monster, meanwhile, notices that old man Billy has become more active and decides to attack back as well. The monster leaps forward with an attack right at Billy, however. The latter overtakes him and strikes first. And just one moment after Billy did so, the monster's head fell from his shoulders. The headless monster only stood still, and its head fell and lay on the ground, chopped off by old man Billy. However, the old man Billy himself can no longer stand on his feet after striking a blow. He begins to fall and drops his sword. Our hero Oscar looks at all this with a huge shock. He cannot believe what is now happening before his eyes. Our hero runs up and grabs Billy, who tells Oscar that everything is fine, but Oscar realizes that the old man is dying. Already passing away in Oscar's arms, old Billy says that he has no regrets and is glad that he was able to die in this way. Holding his talisman in his hands, Billy talks about not just passing away, but destroying his strongest enemy, and he's glad he did. Already on death's doorstep, old Billy takes out his cigarette and starts lighting it. Immediately afterward, barely breathing and wheezing with his whole body, Billy puts a cigarette in his mouth and starts smoking. With a smile on his face, smoking a cigarette, old Billy tells our hero that he was able to defeat this monster in one fell swoop. Old Billy also talks about how if he had managed to survive, he would have been the leader of the squad. Our hero Oscar begins to motivate old Billy, saying that he will definitely become captain. With tears in his eyes, Oscar looks at a dying Billy and talks about how his sword is as beautiful as he thought it would be. In the moment, old man Billy's cigarette falls out of his mouth and onto the ground, and the old man himself closes his eyes in the rain. Oscar continued to sit beside the dying old man Billy, and someone behind him began to climb out of the skull of the slain monster. A red spider came out of the skull, and our hero continued to sit by the old man and talk about how he himself had never been afraid of death. Our hero recalls how he spent his entire childhood lying in the hospital and could not even see. In complete loneliness, he spent more than 1 year of his life. Oscar says that more than once he thought about suicide, but the light that came from the window motivated him. In this light coming from the window, our hero always saw his family, who stretches his hand to meet him always. Immediately after, Oscar adds that he owes the old man Billo for saving their town today. Oscar picks up the talisman that Billy had and says that he's very grateful to Billy for saving him. In the moment, Oscar puts his hand on old Billy's arm and asks what he can do for him. While our hero Oscar was trying to find out, some huge monster with a strange head showed up behind him. In the moment, our hero Oscar grabs old man Billy's beautiful sword and places it in his hand, clutching the hilt. The monster standing behind apparently prepares to attack our hero, however, he turns out not to be so simple and turns the sword over. In the moment, our hero turns around and looks directly into the eyes of his opponent with a huge aura of energy. In a moment, sharp marks from attacks, multiple attacks, begin to appear around the monster, and the monster itself begins to hiss. Our hero Oscar starts moving very fast. He uses the dancing star technique. In the moment, Billy points his sword directly at his monster opponent and talks about how he has an ugly face. With a very angry face, our hero continues to attack and talk about how if he can't get killed right away, he has a solution. And that solution is that he will attack again and again, time after time, until he wins this fight. The monster is starting to react rather horribly to this. He didn't expect it to be like this. In a moment, our hero's very powerful aura covers everything around him and begins to push him at a tremendous speed harder and harder. Our hero decides that he will attack to the last living place, and yellow wings appear behind him. Meanwhile, jumpy beams of energy begin to emerge directly from the monster's skin and body, demolishing everything in their path. Our hero achieves his goal. With tremendous force, he presses right into his opponent. Immediately after that, the aura and power of our hero squeezes the monster into the floor, and everything around it is immersed in a yellow aura. In the moment, our hero punches through the monster and delivers a few more crushing blows that hit everything around him. In a moment, our hero's aura became so strong and powerful that the monster simply began to tear itself apart from such pressure on itself. Our hero returned to the floor and stood with his sword in hand and just stared at the dying monster beside him. Immediately after which he will decide to draw his sword from his opponent, realizing that he has struck him enough. However, for our hero, such attacks also became quite heavy. He can barely stand on his feet and realizes that he almost died. But at the same time, he understands exactly what he was protecting and what it was all about, and that motivates him to hang in there. Looking at the corpse of Old Man Billy, our hero realizes that if it weren't for Billy's merit, he wouldn't be able to defeat the ghostly monster now. In the moment, our hero walks over to Billy's body, grabs his hand, and talks about how he only feels guilt towards his aunt and brother. However, today the third in this list is the Old Man Billy, who with the price of his life saved the family of our hero Oscar. Our hero carries the body of an old man, and he in turn no longer has a glimpse of life. Our hero proceeds to carry Billy's body and talk about how he saved his entire world today in exchange for his life. Continuing to carry the old man, Oscar talks about how in exchange he will protect for 10 years the world that was dear to Billy. In the moment, some people run out of the Povar nearby, apparently from the squad, who run straight to meet Oscar. However, in a moment they stop abruptly and notice something, after which they are very much surprised. Our hero notices them and tearfully informs them that he delivered the general of the squad, Old Billy, as best he could. At the moment the guys in the squad notice that their general Old Man Billy is dead. They immediately start screaming in a way that can be heard throughout the town. Meanwhile, the events of the story bring us back to Oscar's brother and aunt, who were trying to continue eating that very evening. Oscar's aunt talked about not being able to eat sitting still when Oscar himself just took off and ran away, but Oscar's brother says it's okay. Oscar's aunt talks about how she would really like to believe that all is really well with him right now. Meanwhile, the events of the story move forward and take us to our hero Oscar's town the next day. It's hot sunny. Apparently our hero is now in one of the buildings in the city as of this morning. The events of the story show us Oscar sitting in a chair dramatically and loudly declaring that everything is right. Our hero sits directly across from a squad member and talks about what happened in general and how Billy died. One of the squad deputies stands with a paper and reflects on what happened, berating our hero Oscar. In the moment, he abruptly turns to Oscar and talks about how he doesn't understand how he managed to get into the portal. In the moment, our hero tells us with a smile on his face that he just had enough of a sharp look to get into the portal. One of the squad members turns to our hero with shock and asks for details of Billy's fight with the monster. Our hero talks with great enthusiasm about what happened and how Old Billy defeated everyone. However, one of the squad members pays attention to our hero's story, marveling at some of the details. Another man from the squad also calls attention to the detail, saying that he is very surprised to see such action from Billy. One of the squad leaders points out that waking up a Rune is a pretty strange thing even so. Jessica tearfully talks about how she is very disappointed with everything that is going on and would definitely save Billy. One of the squad members turns to the others and talks about how they shouldn't stand around like fools and should introduce themselves. The guy with glasses introduces himself as Richard. He's the deputy clan. Behind him stands Ron. He's the captain of their squad. Our hero is also approached by Jessica, who introduces herself and wishes our hero well. The kid next to him turns to our hero and introduces himself as Franklin. He's also from the squad. Another girl tearfully introduces herself as Amelia and is very shy. Another kid nearby introduces himself as Willie. He's a sniper in his squad. The squad deputy is standing nearby and talking about the fact that various burns were found on the monster's face. However, the deputy detachment deputy says that in general it does not matter much anymore. The issues are exhausted for them. However, in a moment right in front of him, the head of the squad appears and says that it's time to ask Oscar. In the moment, the chapter sits down directly across from Oscar and asks about why he didn't join the watch earlier. Oscar talks about going on patrol in honor of Billy and will serve exactly 10 years in their unit. He talks about how it's very hard to get into their organization. It's private and closed. It can't be that easy. However, our hero is not intimidated by this. In return, he sets conditions, saying that all the problems he takes on himself and will solve himself. With a rather sweet smile, the squad leader declares that so be it. He accepts our hero's terms. After which, the squad leader holds out some papers and says that training will begin in 5 months. The leader explains that the organization is military, and you can't just get in here, and our hero smiles, realizing that's what he wanted. Leaving the room, the group leader informs the newcomers that they are not providing lodging and food. Oscar turns to the leader of the group and asks him about where he should live for a month in such a case. In the moment, Jessica approaches our hero, puts her hands on his shoulder and talks about staying with her. Our hero is very surprised by such an offer from Jessica, but thanks her for her help. However, Franklin takes our hero Oscar aside and tells him that he can show and tell him everything himself. Our hero agrees to Franklin's help in this matter and begins to walk off down the hallway with him. However, at one point Franklin stops and speaks sharply to Oscar, saying that he has a request for the One. In the moment, Franklin grabs our hero by the shoulders and asks him if he can go with him to Jessica's house together. However, Franklin follows up by informing him that it's just a joke and he doesn't want to scare the newcomer at all. At this point, our hero Oscar becomes disappointed in Franklin because he expected Franklin to be a much more serious person. In the moment, our hero turns to Franklin and asks why there are only 5 men in the squad, which surprises Franklin. Franklin goes above and says that Oscar is very attentive surprisingly and is quick to point this out. Franklin tells us that they don't really belong in the military, which is why there are so few of them, and they are needed for emergencies. Franklin also explains the fact that the usual 2-person missions involve 2 people each. Our hero also reflects on this. Franklin also talks about how there is a squad for every neighborhood, and they operate in the Hollywood area. Our hero talks about how he now finally understands how this system works in Night Watch. Franklin talks about getting it right, and all the roles and tasks in the squad are assigned to everyone. Franklin also talks about how sometimes there are situations that are too horrible for even them to be in power. This surprises Oscar. Franklin turns to our hero and starts talking about something that greatly affects the man in the squad. From that moment on, the events of the story go forward and take us to the next sunny day. Our hero, using a map and a note, goes to someone's house, and in the moment he does arrive and is greatly surprised by the huge house. Our hero Oscar begins to remember Jessica's words that her house is quite large, however he didn't expect it to be that big. Oscar presses the button and starts to walk inside, thinking about how this one is just gigantic. Meanwhile, Jessica, who lives there, starts running downstairs and yelling that she's on her way when she hears the gate bell ring. Jessica runs out to the door and grabs our hero by the arm, saying that he has decided to come to her after all. Together, they run down some huge corridor. Jessica asks our hero to take whatever shoes he wants and follow her. Oscar picks out his pink bunny slippers, the same ones Jessica has. She talks about how they look good on him. In a moment, a girl very much like Amelia appears from behind and turns sharply to Jessica. Amelia turns to our hero, saying she is surprised that he decided to come. Oscar is also surprised to see her. After which all 3 of them head upstairs. Jessica talks about how she's about to show Oscar his room. Oscar asks Jessica about where her parents are and if he will bother them by living here. With a little sadness, Jessica replies that her parents are not with her, as they have joined the research team. Trailing off, she talks about how, after they disappeared in one of the shadow zones, it was exactly 5 years ago. Jessica sadly tells this, and our hero doesn't even know how he should best react in such a situation. Jessica opens the door to our hero's room and asks him to go ahead, saying that this is now his room. Jessica shows our hero his room and tells him that she has already prepared and made everything here for him. Jessica also tells Oscar that he will need her or Amelia, then he better knock on the door before entering. Jessica warns Oscar that if she finds out about any of his lewd intentions, she'll just nail him. Jessica tells our hero that she's the chief of strength in their squad and shows off her biceps, saying she's very strong. Immediately afterward, Oscar talks about how he understood everything perfectly and asks Jessica if she has paper and a pen. Meanwhile, the events of our story don't stand still and are transported to some high-rise building. In this high-rise building, there are people standing at one of the apartment doors and calling inside, trying to summon someone. Oscar's aunt opens the door, immediately asking him if he is back, but there are other people at the door. One of the guys standing at the door addresses Oscar's aunt by name, asking her if it's her. These two guys turn out to be from the squad. They talk about being in charge of recruiting people for the military squad. When Oscar's aunt hears about the draft and the military unit, she is very surprised and even a little frightened by what they are saying. Immediately afterward, they enter the kitchen together, where the squad members hand Oscar's aunt the military documents. Oscar's aunt started telling the military that Oscar himself never wanted to be in the military and never talked about it. However, Oscar's brother enters their dialogue, saying that what Oscar really wanted to do, but couldn't do because of his eyesight. Oscar's aunt starts crying. She doesn't understand why he made that particular decision. It scares her. The military from the squad tells Oscar's aunt that they will be monitoring her nephew's eyesight, so there won't be any problems. Afterward, one of the squad members holds out money to Oscar's aunt, saying that it's a subsidy of their first. This alarms Oscar's aunt, and she asks if he is involved in something dangerous, and that's why the payments are being made. Oscar's aunt starts asking dozens of strange questions and questioning about the military unit and what will happen to Oscar. The squad members explain everything to her and go outside where Oscar is already standing. They discuss among themselves that they are very tired. The guys from the squad inform Oscar that everything has been explained to his aunt and she has accepted everything, including the money. This pleases Oscar. The leader of the squad steps forward and talks about how they had to give Oscar's entire annual salary. As they are leaving, the squad leader turns to Oscar and tells him to come to dinner tonight, much to his surprise. Immediately afterward, Franklin and the leader begin to walk forward, with Oscar standing behind them and looking at them in surprise. The guys from the squad leave, and our hero decides to call his aunt and talk to her in person. Oscar's aunt immediately starts asking about why he left so abruptly and didn't say anything to anyone about everything. Our hero walks around the yards of the house and tells his aunt that Moo is sorry and he was wrong about a lot of things. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to the castle, apparently again in the dreams of our hero Oscar. In the courtyard of this huge castle, the goddess Anfisa rides alone on a swing. For quite some time, she swings on her swing with a smile on her face, but in a moment, she notices something. It turns out to be our hero Oscar, who turns to her and stands next to her with something in his hands. At the sight of Oscar, Anfisa gets very excited. She talks about how she is very happy to see him here. Oscar tells Anfisa that he is also mutually happy to see her, and it's already time to get his medication. Oscar starts pouring medicine into his hand and talking about how once Anfisa finishes the full course, all of her children will come back to her. Anfisa obeys Oscar and takes all the medication. He sits down next to her and sadly exhales contentedly. In the moment, Anfisa turns to our hero Oscar and says that apparently something is bothering him a lot. Anfisa holds out a mug of tea to our hero. He takes it and says that indeed it is. Anfisa addresses our hero, saying that she will then make him a gift to cheer him up. Anfisa dramatically reaches her hand up and talks about giving Oscar her bracelet so she can always be by his side. However, in a moment she looks sharply at her hand and notices that there is no bracelet on it, much to her surprise. Anfisa starts turning around and trying to find her bracelet with a very shocked face. However, following this, she shouts sharply that she remembered where her bracelet was. She spoke so loudly that everyone around her heard it. Anfisa informs our hero that she once lost her bracelet and was now remembering it. Hearing such an interesting answer, our hero is sharply surprised because he does not understand how the goddess could lose the bracelet. Oscar holds up a book of myths about the gods and asks Anfisa which god was able to win the bracelet from her. In the moment, the goddess tells Oscar that it wasn't a god at all, but a man like himself. Hearing this, Oscar is greatly surprised. He yells and asks about the fact that was there really someone here before him? At this point, our hero Oscar begins to think that in all likelihood, he may not be the only person here. Oscar begins to reflect on the fact that in all the time he's been here, there could have been other people the same. In the moment, Oscar turns to Anfisa rather abruptly and asks her about whether she remembers what the man looked like. In a moment, Anfisa thinks about it and replies that she remembers a certain girl with long black hair, about 12, 13 years old. Immediately after these words, Anfisa starts telling Oscar that there is actually one very strange pattern. Anfisa starts talking about how she and this girl were playing a game on her destiny. This game had rules that if the girl wins, she takes the bracelet, and if she loses, she gives the baby to Anfisa. Our hero Oscar cannot imagine such a situation, because how can a little girl defeat the goddess of the night? Oscar asks Anfisa what she remembers about the girl, but other than the end of her name, the goddess remembers nothing. Realizing all this, our hero decides to go to the castle and think about it, because it is a very important clue. Upon arriving at the castle, Oscar starts going through all the things in all the rooms in order to find a clue about this girl. Oscar is on the lookout and ponders the fact that there is no way this girl could have cleaned up her tracks. In a moment, Oscar stops and holds his gaze, thus he activated his ability. With his ability, he was able to find some paper that was taped to the table. In the moment, Oscar opens the piece of paper and notices that it is a letter, and with great excitement begins to read it. There was a lot of information in the letter, but the most important thing was that the girl talked about some place that was under the hospital. Our hero finds a hatch of some sort in the floor, and realizes that this is apparently the one in question, and there are many more sectors down below. Of course, Oscar couldn't resist his curiosity and headed straight down to find out and see everything. In the moment, Oscar starts to go downstairs, realizing that this place around here is very strange. As a result, our hero comes out into some huge corridor, on the side of which there are some cages. He starts walking among them and notices that there is no one even in them, and the place is very strange and lifeless. However, at the point of walking by one of the cameras, our hero stops abruptly and begins to look inside. Looking right inside the cage, our hero notices a monster there, and not just any monster, but the same Ghost King he defeated with Billy. In the moment, the Ghost King monster also notices our hero Oscar and abruptly jumps straight towards him in an attempt to attack. In the moment, a menu appears right above Oscar's head that informs him that Oscar can choose the fate for the monster he killed. The first and most basic option is to erase the monster's soul from the world, thus destroying it forever. But the second option is to scare the monster and make it obey, thus using it as a slave. Our hero begins to remember his fight with this monster and realizes that apparently many souls go here after death. Oscar realizes that by killing monsters in this way, he can create workers for himself at the hospital. Thinking it all over for a moment, our hero Oscar contemplates what could be if he defeats the true god. After all, according to this system, if you believe it, it turns out that after defeating the god, Oscar will own the god. Meanwhile, the ghostly monster looks rather surprised at the non-hero and yells at him. The monster lowers his head, and in response, our hero only looks at him and simply remains silent. But later he does turn to the monster and asks him if he realizes the situation he's in. Oscar reaches out to the monster's body and talks about how the monster is very strong and would be a wonderful assistant. However, immediately after these words, Oscar squeezes the monster's head until it bleeds and says that unfortunately he is not happy to see him. After that, Oscar holds this monster's head in his hands for a while longer, creating a blast of energy. Whereupon the monster, killed and blown up, covered in blood, falls to the ground, and Oscar begins to just walk away in silence. The events of the story take us to the next day. Oscar walks into the office and hears about someone yelling about a monster. Oscar is greatly surprised and immediately looks ahead sharply. Oscar walks forward down the hallway and tries to find the room where the conversation is coming from. Once he finds it, he looks inside. And inside the room, some grandmother is sitting at a big table talking about how she really did see a monster. Sitting across from her is Jessica, who asks her grandmother to take it easy and speak more slowly. Grandma, meanwhile, blushes and tells her story, how she was out with her husband. But something terrible happened. Grandma grabs Jessica's hand and talks about the moment a certain female monster appeared from around the corner. The grandmother complains that this woman monster was very beautiful and started seducing her husband very badly. This whole picture is watched by our hero Oscar, who did not even think that the squad is engaged in the proceedings of such nonsense. Time marches on, Franklin escorts Granny out, and Jessica promises that their squad will take up the matter. Oscar approaches Jessica and asks about what it was. She replies that it's their regular job. Franklin explains to Oscar the fact that serious work is actually quite scarce in their town. With great joy and pride, Franklin tells our hero that he can just do stuff in his spare time. Oscar asks Jessica if it's all true. She replies that unfortunately it is. Our hero Oscar exhales and realizes that there is an upside to this, but it still pisses him off. Jessica turns to Oscar and talks about how the squad captain asked Oscar to come to his training site. Immediately afterward, our hero Oscar goes straight to the head of the squad, just as Jessica asked him to. Oscar looks directly at his head and notices that the latter is throughout at the moment in meditation. However, in a moment, the clan leader abruptly opens his eyes and throws his sword directly towards Oscar, much to his surprise. Immediately afterward, the clan leader turns to Oscar and tells him to learn how to handle a sword first. Our hero Oscar looks directly at the sword the clan leader threw at him and realizes that it is apparently the same sword of old Billy. Our hero opens the sword and immediately sees the inscription with Billy's name on the hilt, realizing that he is not mistaken. The squad leader stands up and talks about how Oscar is one of the few people Billy liked, so he decided to give his sword to him. The head of the squad looks straight into Oscar's face and talks about how he will help him with anything if need be. Immediately after, the squad leader tells Oscar's daily schedule of how he will handle the sword and learn. The clan head had planned the day so that Oscar would have almost no free time from training, which didn't make him very happy. In the moment, Oscar turns to the captain and talks about how they have real swords after all, how they can start practicing. In the moment, our hero creates a very powerful image of himself in his head and says that he won't hold back either. Immediately afterward, our hero Oscar snaps out of his seat and starts thrusting right at his opponent, the head of the clan. The head of the clan notices this and just stands staring at Oscar, realizing that he has overestimated himself. In an instant, the clan leader throws a powerful punch right at Oscar, and he's sent straight into the boxes standing next to him. For a moment, Oscar cried out in shock and pain, and began to lie among the boxes, realizing what he felt was terrible. However, right after, the clan leader approaches him and tells Oscar to get up and keep fighting on. Oscar stands up, smiles, and tries to make the point that he's doing fine, and he's not in pain at all right now. The battle between Oscar and the clan head was gaining momentum as time went on. You and the guys passing by began to notice it. Some time passes from that moment, and the events of the story take us right to the medical kit. A member of the squad sits next to Oscar, who talks about how everything will be okay, and medicine will help Oscar get back on his feet. In the moment, Oscar recalls his fight with the head, realizing that he was dozens of times weaker than him, and his opponent's blows were very powerful. Oscar also recalls a very fierce look from the clan leader during the fight, and can't understand why he looked that way, since it's just normal training. Oscar cringes as he recalls every moment he had during their battle, realizing how much stronger the clan leader is. Oscar genuinely can't understand why the clan leader beat him so badly during his first training session. A squadmate helps Oscar tug on his wounds and talks about how it's generally unusual but expected, as the clan leader is very strong. Oscar begins to also remember the old man Billy's fight against the monster, and thinks about how Billy would have fared against the head. Oscar's partner sitting next to him talks about how Billy has actually always been on par with the captain in terms of strength. Oscar's partner says that everything will be fine, and that he will surely recover quickly and become stronger. Immediately after, Oscar's partner, sitting next to Ronnie, started talking about how it was time to discuss runes. Our hero Oscar talks about how his sense of God is developed very strongly by as much as 20 meters. However, our hero's stories don't really surprise the sitting Ronnie next to him, and in a moment they see Jessica walking next to him. They turn their attention to her together and notice that she is only walking upright with a plain face. Oscar starts to stare after her and doesn't take his eyes off her. Ronnie does the same at this point. Oscar rather surprisingly turns around sharply and looks into Ronnie's eyes, who in turn does the same. And right after that, with a very serious face, Oscar tells Ronnie about looking with his powers and recognizing that Jessica is dressed in white. Ronnie abruptly shows a barking gesture and looks straight into Oscar's face, saying he was thinking the same thing. Immediately afterwards, Ronnie and Oscar shake hands, stand up and say goodbye. Afterward, Ronnie turns to Oscar and talks about how she's about to explain to him what the forbidden rune is. Ronnie pulls out a book and talks about how it's an actual breakdown of the danger level of people in their battles. Ronnie explains that the weakest runes are number 600, with which you can at most kill a fly. Next are the runes numbered 400, 599, with which it is possible to cripple and wound someone. After that, go runes numbered 200, 399. With them it is already possible to fight even with mystical creatures. Toward the end are runes numbered 90, 199. People with them are born 1 in a million, and the captain of the squad is one of them. Ronnie explains to our hero Oscar that runes are indeed very dangerous and must be handled carefully. There is a major level of risk, runes up to level 89. People with them have gone beyond human comprehension and can single-handedly destroy a city. Ronnie explains to our hero the fact that if Billy awakened one of the runes to level 89, he could become a general. These stories alarm our hero. He realizes that this is all already very serious indeed. Ronnie also talks about our hero's rune being number 003, much to Oscar's surprise. But Ronnie follows up by adding that there's nothing to be happy about, since it's the forbidden rune of a god, not Oscar's, and it's useless in his hands. Ronnie talks about how although Oscar has shown a lot of strength, it's still only a fraction of what it could be at full strength. Ronnie explains that Oscar either only has a small fraction of the god's powers, or he just hasn't been able to unlock the rest of his abilities yet. Oscar goes with Ronnie to some room, and Ronnie talks about how this is part of Oscar's training. Ronnie tells our hero that there are thousands of guns in this room, and Oscar should avoid all the shots using his powers. Ronnie adds that since Oscar is still inexperienced, they will start with only 50 bullets per second. In the moment, Oscar, with a very shocked face, tells Ronnie that he has now been overcome by some very ominous feeling. Oscar starts talking about how his feet are chained to the ground and he can't do anything. He's very scared. Ronnie responds by talking about how fear will always haunt Oscar, and immediately afterward turns on his guns in that room. Our hero talks about how he already wants to get away from here very badly. He starts dodging shots. Ronnie, meanwhile, stands next to him and also self-dodges with a smile, showing Oscar that it's very easy. Oscar notices in the moment that Ronnie is making it pretty easy and simple, and decides that it won't be hard for him either. However, Ronnie leaves the room with a smile, and the shots start hitting our hero directly as his screams come from the room. The events of our story carry forward. Oscar is walking somewhere outside with his briefcase from school. One of his classmates turns to him and tells him that he is very slow and asks him to speed up. Oscar abruptly pays attention. He was clearly thinking about something else, and later says he'll try to be quicker. One of Oscar's classmates sharply embraces him and says that he has been very strange lately. Oscar's classmate also notices the wounds on his body and says that it's all very strange. Next, the guys all walk forward together, however. At a point, Oscar stops and abruptly turns his attention to something. Oscar talks about how he forgot his keys at school, so he'll be back later and asks not to wait for him. Between themselves, the boys discuss the fact that Oscar has been very strange lately, and Oscar himself comes back to the school. Oscar stands and stares straight at the school building, and for some reason feels some kind of fear unexplainable. However, he does enter the school and starts walking through its hallways looking for something. The whole school is empty. He walks through the hallways rather carefully and quietly, and then walks over to one of the classrooms and opens the doors. Oscar walks inside and notices that the classroom is quite nice, cleaned up and nice, and looks at something. Oscar begins to walk around the classroom and look at something, feelings of unease never leaving him. In the moment, our hero senses someone approaching and realizes he needs to act now. Oscar realizes it's the school principal and math teacher. He looks right at them from behind his hiding place. In the moment, the math teacher turns to the principal and asks him to come closer to her. The principal looks at her rather surprised, while our hero Oscar watches the whole thing from behind the door. The principal and the math teacher, meanwhile, enter the classroom, with the Oscar still hiding and watching. The principal asks the math teacher what she needs, but she just stands there and smiles. In a moment, in a rather romantic atmosphere, the math teacher talks about something she's wanted to say to the principal for a long time. Oscar shivers and hides behind his desk, not understanding how the math teacher could like the principal, since he's a total freak. In the moment, the math teacher lowers her head and talks about something she's actually wanted to say for a very long time. Our hero Oscar sticks his head out and starts looking right at it all, noticing that the teacher's eyes have changed. Immediately afterwards, Oscar notices that the teacher herself has changed. She has turned into a monster. A huge snake emerged from the head of the math teacher and attacked the principal. This, of course, left the principal wildly horrified. He had not even remotely expected such a scenario and screamed. Our hero Oscar also himself could not even think that everything would happen like this, and began to close his mouth. The events of our story move forward and take us to some beautiful building at night. Our hero Oscar is holding a plan to assemble a gun, and the man standing next to him is telling him about the device. This man turns out to be the sniper of our hero's squad, who explains everything in detail. Trace Sniper adds that the weapon has only one downside: it does not deal high damage to strong, mythic creatures. But then he also talks about how it's a very effective thing against base opponents. Immediately afterward, the sniper starts the timer, and our hero starts collecting weapons for speed on the table. The sniper suggests that our hero should calm down and feel good about himself so he can perform better. Immediately after that, the sniper says that after collecting the gun should start shooting at 1.3 times. Our hero does so. After a few shots from Oscar, Sniper shouts that that's enough for now. Oscar asks the sniper how his skills are. He talks about how even a blind man would do a better job. Time marches on. Our hero trains with the captain once more, but training with the gun gets him back in shape. Oscar is walking down the hallway as he suddenly hears someone calling him. It was the head with a huge pot in his hands. Our hero sits down at the table and begins to dine with everyone and discuss their domestic problems. Some more time passes and our hero returns to his room at Jessica's house and lies down on his bed tired. Lying in bed, Oscar recalls everything that has happened and first analyzes his bots with the squad captain. Even now, lying in bed, he is analyzing his actions and what he did earlier, deciding that he should train more. The events of our story go forward from that night and take us to the next morning. Oscar has been practicing all night and didn't get any sleep at all. It's hard for him to even go to his school now. Oscar walks into some building and is greeted by Jessica, who informs him that they are in huge trouble. Walking down the corridor of the squad building, Jessica tells our hero that there was a report about a mystical creature. Jessica takes our hero to one of the offices. They go in there together. The captain of the squad together with the deputy listen to some man, and our hero immediately recognizes in him his classmate. A classmate of Oscar's turns his attention to him, and our hero talks about being a temporary member of the Night Watch. The squad deputy asks the narrator to stay focused and continue to tell the story of the mystical creature. Oscar's classmate recalls with horror what happened then in the office and can't even describe it all. A classmate of Oscar's talks about how he caught a math teacher in class who ate the headmaster. A classmate of Oscar's describes her as a huge snake that emerged from the teacher's head and began to roam the classroom. He also tells us that at one point the monster spits out a huge yasitso right after eating the principal. And then he goes on to describe the details, talking about the fact that the director himself came out of that egg afterward. Right after that, the math teacher started going to the principal and talking about how it just tasted wonderful. Oscar's classmate also tells us that after all this, he waited until dawn in the classroom and went to the unit early in the morning. Such a horror story has surprised even the members of the squad, who did not expect such a turn of events. The vice chief praises fellow classmate Oscar and talks about how this opponent will be very tough for them. The squad leader tenses after hearing the story and says that apparently this monster is spreading the infection to others as well. After that, the head of the squad starts telling everyone that there is one most frightening ability among the mythical creatures, and this ability to zombify their victims. Thus the monsters turn such people into their own. In addition to this ability, they also have another one, namely very good stealth in the human body. The deputy head says that in such a case the situation for them will be quite critical because it will be difficult to win. His words turn out to be true, for in the meantime the headmaster is quietly walking around the school among the children. The deputy chief says they should prepare for the worst because it's going to be very dangerous for everyone. Our hero enters the conversation and says that in his opinion it is likely that the infection has already spread outside the school. This is all listened to by Oscar's classmate, who comes to be wildly horrified by what is happening. The squad members discuss the fact that humans can be monsters and not realize it, and this scares Oscar's classmate. Oscar asks Jessica what dark crow is the head and deputy head of the squad talking about right now. Jessica tells the legend of a certain crow that can destroy an entire city with its attack. In the moment, the head of the squad turns to his brother-in-law and asks about what their immediate plan is, since all the maps are already on the table. The deputy head says that it's likely that the main monster already has a lot of puppets, and that's something to keep in mind during combat. The vice chapter suggests splitting into two groups. The first will do what goes to the math teacher's social connections. The second group of the squad will have to go to the school and find out all the information they have so far on the situation. As it happens, Franklin has brought his uniform with him and offers to change his clothes, mentioning that they are going to school after all. The boys are greatly surprised by the school uniforms, especially Jessica and Amelia are in a state of incomprehension. Jessica, along with Amelia, complain that their uniforms don't fit them at all, and on Amelia, they are small. However, at the end they do put on that uniform and start walking inside, and ask our hero Oscar to speed up, saying he's running late. Oscar is about to calmly walk through the gate, but in the moment Amelia, along with Jessica, just brazenly jump the fence. Our hero Oscar decides not to tolerate this attitude, and also accelerates sharply to prove his strength. Oscar also recalls the fact that before they shipped out, they developed a plan where he was given certain tasks and must accomplish them. Running around the school, Oscar realizes that he has a very difficult task because it is worth examining all the students in the school. Oscar runs around the classroom trying to find victims who are also affected by the disease, and at one point he spots someone. Oscar stops outside the classroom and takes a closer look, noticing another person who is stricken with the disease. Oscar continues to run around the school and count the infected. He gives the head information on the 6 affected. The deputy head of the squad talks about how their target is a mythical creature, and the students themselves are innocent. Our hero begins to wonder how many total infected there are in this school if there are 6 people on the first floor alone. Listening to the information from Oscar, the clan leader tells him to continue the work he has started. In the moment, running down the hallway, Oscar stops near one of the offices and notices something sharply. Our hero Oscar walks into some class very tired and immediately greets the teacher standing next to him. The teacher started scolding Oscar and asking him where he had been missing for days and why he wasn't in class. Oscar talks about treating his eyes again. The teacher believes him and asks him to go to class and sits down in his seat. Our hero Oscar starts walking through the whole class and passes near a classmate who told them about the monsters. What Oscar immediately recalls is that before he left on the mission, this guy offered to help with the action. However, in a moment, he stopped abruptly, leaned over, and started talking about how he had wanted to be part of the squad for a very long time. The squad leader listened to him and coldly told him that if the mission went well, he would give him a chance. Michael walks by this classmate, Louise, thinking about all that happened in class. Oscar walks calmly forward, but one of the girls in the class looks up and smiles at him. Oscar comes to his seat and starts to sit down, and some classmates are passing papers amongst themselves. Our hero sits down in his seat and immediately notices all of this, which he pays quite a bit of attention to. Eventually, the day passes, classes end, and at the end, Oscar asks Louise to help him get to know the whole school. Oscar talks about how the next big event will be the flag raising, and it will be very important. Meanwhile, the events of the story show us what some mythical creatures, birds, have hatched in some class. Jessica, along with Amelia, are standing outside some classroom discussing amongst themselves that the door is closed. Jessica talks about how the mission is pretty risky, since they're breaking into an office right now. Jessica, along with Amelia, make their way into the office, realizing that the principal is not in it, and they are relieved. Together, they gather all the evidence in the office and realize that the principal had been in it quite a while before he left. However, at one point, Jessica's attention is strongly drawn to the fact that she smells some sort of pungent stench coming from under the table. Jessica immediately finds the source of the stench. The smell is coming from under the floor under the table, and immediately looks in there. In the moment, Jessica removes a floor tile with a knife and immediately notices the melted human skin underneath. The events of the story take us to Louise, who asks Oscar how many infected people there are among the people in their class. Oscar talks about how unfortunately he was able to find already 2 at once in their class. Immediately afterwards, Oscar also says that among the people passing through here, 5 other people are also infected. Louise points out that most of those infected are girls, especially those who live nearby. Meanwhile, Amelia, along with Jessica, discuss the fact that apparently the source of the infection is indeed in the sorority house. Jessica relays the information and says that everything is clear for them and they are going there to reconnoiter. Meanwhile, Oscar and Louise are walking through the schoolyard, and Louise wonders if Oscar has finished his research. Louise is very worried. He turns to Oscar and tells him that he should hurry, because soon they may be burned. In the moment, Oscar walks up to some younger guys, addresses them and tells them they're fired. Oscar lies to the local kids about the school government, handing them the responsibility of hanging the flag this time. Oscar talks about how if those have issues, they can work it out with the school government. The guys around here are in a lot of shock. Oscar decides now to start the process of raising the flag in front of everyone, and this surprises Louise a lot because he doesn't understand Oscar's plan. Oscar comes on stage and looks at all the members of the school that have gathered and immediately says he has a bad feeling about it. In the moment, our hero Oscar stops abruptly and then takes a huge leap upwards off the ground. Oscar runs forward at breakneck speed and informs the chapter that everyone must now be on standby. The squad leader asks Oscar to calm down and tells him to report on the general condition around him. Oscar reports that he has checked all the members of the school and there are already about 60 infected, and he doesn't know what to do about it. Oscar runs through the school and also informs them that if the squad starts threatening the school, the monster will see and activate the entire army at once. Oscar also talks about how if it goes down like this, it will be a huge disaster for the city as a whole. Meanwhile, the clan leader is fighting someone and talking about how the infection has already gotten out. It turns out the clan head is fighting the headmaster at this moment, or rather his head monster. The director proves to be quite a strong and massive opponent even for a chapter, as he attacks quite sharply and quickly. The head of the squad reports that they are now engaged in the elimination of all sorts of personalities with infection. The squad leader continues to fight the monster and talk about how their situation is even more serious than they thought. The head of the squad also says that they will be checking the social contacts of all people near the infected. The squad leader informs them that based on this, they are unable to support the rest of the squad at the school, so they will have to manage on their own. Rubbing his sword after the battle, the chapter also mentions that their enemy this time is very cunning. Leaving the battlefield, the squad leader asks to find the body and the main monster in the shortest time possible, whatever he can. The squad leader also orders him to be killed if found, and adds that the information can be relayed to the sniper on the roof. Our hero runs forward and says that he has understood and accepted everything, and is already beginning to act as told. The head of the squad also announces that he and his deputy will also continue their business of finding the next opponent. Zam asks the head if this is a difficult task for Oscar since he's still a rookie. Chapter recalls Oscar's behavior in battle and training and says that Oscar has a strong zeal for strength and will be fine. The head of the squad says that all they have to do is not to get in his way because he is climbing to the top alone. Meanwhile, the flag-raising ceremony was over and everyone started walking home and back to school. Oscar notices this, of course, and relays the information that a huge crowd of girls are being sent to the dormitory. Oscar informs Jessica and Amelia of this, adding that the girls are walking very fast. Jessica asks about whether they're all infected. Oscar says it's hard for him to tell, but there are definitely infected. Oscar asks Jessica and Amelia to be more careful, and meanwhile they notice that the girls have started to return to the core. The girls at school started paying attention to Amelia and Jessica, noticing that they weren't from their school after all. One of the girls approaches the squad members asking who they are. Jessica says she's looking for her friend here. However, the girls at school immediately realize that no friend of Jessica's is here and tell her that she's mistaken. Jessica talks about, then apologizes for bothering her and takes Amelia's hand and starts to walk away. The very same girls begin to laugh and smile achidically as they stare in Amelia and Jessica's wake. In the moment, they surround our squad members and talk about taking their time to get out of here so quickly. One of them starts stroking Jessica and talking about how she didn't know there was a pretty girl like her at school. Jessica begins to realize where this is all going and guesses, but shock and shame strike her in an instant. The other girls, meanwhile, start hitting on Amelia as well, saying that she is also turning out to be very pretty. Amelia is abruptly grabbed by her arms. She immediately starts crying and asks Jessica what she should do in such a situation. The girl standing next to Amelia abruptly turns her head into a huge snake and talks about wanting to eat Amelia. Seeing this, Amelia becomes wildly terrified. She starts screaming in panic and doesn't realize what is happening at all. Jessica at this point also finally realizes that they are trapped by the monsters and they should act more drastically. The girl standing next to Jessica also becomes a monster and yells at Jessica, asking her to let herself be eaten. Immediately afterward, Jessica grabs her weapon and creates a huge stream of flames around her. In a moment, the blade Jessica is holding abruptly changes shape and becomes a different one, attacking everything behind her. With her blade, Jessica literally turns the heads of her opponents into bare skulls. In just one swing, Jessica disposed of her opponent and went on about her business up ahead. She confidently and beautifully displayed her skills to all, and her opponent stood behind her in flames after her sweeps. It was so strong that the monsters standing near Amelia froze in horrified amazement. In the moment, Jessica begins to unwrap her weapon in her hands and threaten everyone around her with it. Immediately afterward, Jessica takes a huge swing, and in just one motion, she destroys all of her opponents. Jessica's skills are beyond all limits. She is very skillful and beautiful with weapons and fire. Jessica stands and looks at the corpses of the monsters, while Amelia nearby talks about how these monsters are as horrible as possible. Jessica is about to leave as in a moment Amelia turns away and notices something, asking Jessica to look back as well. Amelia, along with Jessica, notice some strange silhouette and a huge, powerful aura that pierces everything around them. With a rather happy face, Jessica talks about how such opponents aren't strong enough to overpower her. However, in the moment, with the help of her powers, Jessica checks out everyone around her, noticing with shock that there are quite a few of them. The monsters in the moment start to surround Jessica and Amelia. Here they are already worried because they don't know what to do in such a situation. Jessica turns to Amelia and talks about how this is going to be problematic since there are at least 18 people here. But the very next moment, Jessica declares that she doesn't care about that in general, and she's ready to fight and starts to take action. In the moment, the monsters come crashing down right at Jessica and Amelia, and they in turn raise a powerful aura of fire around them. The battle between the two becomes clearly quite epic and powerful as massive explosions come out of the building. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to Oscar's classroom, where everyone is quietly discussing and socializing. In the moment, one of Oscar's classmates walks into this classroom and turns sharply to one of the girls. The girl he turned to looks straight at him and he at her, and he holds out some kind of white bottle to her. This kid creates a pretty cute aura around him and talks about how the girl across from him wanted milk, and lo and behold, he brought it. This does make the girl across from him quite happy. It tells her that he is very kind and she is grateful to him. The guy turns to her and talks about how if she needs anything else, he can get it for her pretty quickly. A girl approaches a guy and asks him to wait for her tonight after school behind the garages, and he of course agrees. However, the moment their dialogue is interrupted is when our hero Oscar abruptly rises from his seat. In the moment, our hero Oscar turns to this girl and talks about how he has liked her for a very long time. However, Oscar says all this with a rather cold face, and the kid behind him is just as wildly shocked as their classmates. The girl he approached, named Kokoro, is also very surprised and stands all red. Immediately afterward, Oscar revisits her and talks about wanting her as his girlfriend. The guy standing next to him is horrified by such statements. He can't believe everything that is happening. Immediately afterward, Kokoro declares that she agrees to his proposal, much to the shock of the guy standing next to her. Oscar turns to this girl with a small smile and talks about how they should meet up after school then. With a rather happy face and red cheeks, she talks about how she will be looking forward to this meeting very much. Walking down the hallway, Oscar is approached by Louise and asks about why Oscar saved this guy from dying in the office today. Oscar talks about how even though that kid didn't communicate well with him, it's his duty to save people. Oscar also adds that this topic doesn't interest him much and suggests moving forward, saying that the other guys might have had something happen. And Oscar, of course, turns out to be right, as Amelia and Jessica have a battle going on against the monsters in one of the school's buildings. Other girls started running out of the dormitory and talking about their phone connection not working. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to a sniper who is watching the whole situation because he has the opportunity to make a phone call. In the moment, the sniper pulls out a weapon made in his time by Old Billy, namely a road space sign. Immediately after, the sniper activates it and abruptly notices the fact that the sign has taken on a green color, which surprises him. The kids at school start pointing to each other at the sky and talking about how it's turned green for some reason. Some were frightened by it and some were delighted. They all started looking up at the sky and taking pictures of it from below. Meanwhile, the sky does indeed turn green, a huge beam of green color resting right into the clouds, creating a rift. Louise asks our hero what's going on. He replies that apparently there was a ring space error. Oscar talks about how the best thing to do in a situation like this is to raise a ruckus to distract everyone around you from what's going on. Louise is surprised by such a task. However, our hero Oscar supports him, saying that he is the best in the matter. Louise decides to take a risk and assume some role in the mission, and starts paying attention to herself. At attention, very loudly and sharply, Louise starts yelling someone's name several times, calling out to herself. The girl he calls asks him not to come any closer and talks about how she doesn't understand his intentions. All flushed and angry, Louise yells about how much he likes her. He calls her out on dates to his place. Louise shouts this so loudly that everyone around can hear, and the girl herself falls to the ground at that moment from shock. Our hero Oscar, meanwhile, leaves the scene and talks about how Louise clearly has a talent for drawing attention to herself. Jessica and Amelia, meanwhile, notice a sudden noise outside and discuss what might be going on in there. However, they can't be distracted much, for they now have a battle going on against the monsters that surround them in the enclosure. In the moment, Jessica decides to act strongly and radically, and activates one of the strongest forbidden runes available to her. Wild flames rise up around her, which simply cannot be put out and let past their eyes, and she herself is clearly aggressive. Immediately afterward, Jessica aims her weapon forward and decides to use one of her abilities in combat. Some girl runs up to Jessica and Amelia. She immediately turns to them and talks about why they are still here, but they reply that they were putting out a fire. This girl asks Amelia and Jessica to forget about the fire and leave quickly, saying that it is very dangerous here. Immediately afterward, this girl helps our squad members downstairs and out the stairs. However, in the moment, our hero Oscar appears nearby and immediately fires a few shots upwards. The bullets he fires hit the girl who helped Amelia and Jessica downstairs. Immediately afterwards, this girl turns into a huge monster, which scares Amelia standing next to her very much. Her head becomes like a lizard's, and she herself abruptly begins to scream and growl at Amelia beside her. This is all noticed by Oscar, who immediately snaps out of it and realizes he should act. Amelia is in wild shock. She grabs her weapon and starts waving it around, defending herself and everything nearby. Oscar notices that Amelia is clearly not doing well and starts running right at her, firing shots upwards. Immediately afterward, Oscar reaches out to Amelia and asks her if she's okay and can move on. From behind, our hero is approached by Jessica. She is quite surprised by all that is going on. Oscar asks Jessica where all the other monsters are, and she proudly proclaims that she was able to kill them all. Oscar asks Jessica where the main monster is and if she was able to kill it, and here she doesn't answer so confidently anymore. Oscar talks about how he probably has his own lair where he sits, but Jessica doesn't think monsters can be that smart. Oscar talks about how this monster clearly has a high intelligence compared to the others, and that's important to remember. Oscar also talks about how the monster's strategy is no less surprising, as he began his defeat in the sorority house. And after that, he moved on to more difficult victims, but he did it in special places, Oscar says. And if it hadn't been pure coincidence when Louise saw it, the city might have been in the most tremendous danger of all time. Jessica talks about the fact that this is the first time she's seen a monster that is highly intelligent, also so much so. In a moment, their conversation is interrupted by Amelia. She points to something up above and immediately asks what it is. The guys look up and immediately notice the silhouette of a man with the aura of a snake monster. Immediately afterwards, Oscar and Jessica decide to go in pursuit of this monster and take off. Oscar yells out that the monster is very fast and acting with purpose. Apparently it is trying to get on the roof. Some time passes, quite tired, but our heroes climb up on the roof to this monster. Oscar looks at the monster and can't understand the motive for his actions, as everything else around him and the monster looks at Oscar. In a moment, this monster becomes wildly huge and its head turns into a bird's head. Immediately after which the monster starts screaming wildly and very loudly, which scares everyone around him with its mere sound. Our heroes cover their ears, but still can't resist such a harsh and very nasty sound all around. Other kids near the school are also in wild shock. They can't understand what the sound is and fall to the ground. In the moment, some of them become monsters and start attacking their own friends in 1 second. Meanwhile, on the roof, the main monster is laughing and our hero Oscar starts pointing a gun at him. However, before he can even get a shot off, his monster opponent immediately starts running away from him. Jessica also rushes to Oscar's aid to stop their common enemy, but they are not in time. Jessica jumps down and talks about how she doesn't intend to just stand there, and she's going after that monster. At the moment, all the people start running away and screaming that there is a huge evil monster nearby. Louise is also there. He realizes that people are in a severe panic, and if it is not stopped, everyone will die. Many of the monsters have already started to arrive at the place and notice the fact that people are panicking and can't control themselves. Meanwhile, our hero Oscar reflects on the situation and remembers the sniper's words that guns aren't just made for killing. Oscar starts firing his gun upwards, drawing attention to himself and saying that he asked everyone to shut up. Oscar fires a few powerful shots straight up into the sky, and it really gets the job done and gets his attention. People around started approaching Okar and asking who he was and where he got the gun, and asking the police for help. Oscar, meanwhile, realizes that the monsters are also here and decides to activate his powers. He immediately attacks the monsters that are closest to him, thus giving them a very unexpected blow. Oscar's ability alone was enough to neutralize the monster man from everyone. Oscar stands with sword in hand, and addressing everyone asks them to be quiet, saying that he has come to help. Oscar turns to everyone and tells them that there are no more monsters left among them, and asks them all to go home. The events of the story move forward. Little by little, people began to leave the barrier of permanence and go to their homes. Meanwhile, the squad sniper is trying to figure out the workings of the road space sign. Meanwhile, in the school itself, there are still many people who could still fall victim to the monsters. They try to lock themselves in classrooms. By building barricades of items, they try to stop the monsters, but they clearly have a hard time doing so. The guys in the classrooms keep pulling down every item they have. Dubia closed the wall, and the girls in the classrooms are running around screaming. Such is the atmosphere in every class now. Almost no one knows what to do or what will happen next in such danger. A few guys led by Louise decide to go to the 3rd floor to save the others. However, in order to stay out of the classroom and into the hallways, they decide to use the fabric as a rope and throw it off the window. Louise's classmates turn to him and ask him about whether it would be foolish to do such a thing. He says it's nothing. Immediately afterward, he decides to be the first to start going down to show his example to the rest of the class. However, there are already monsters waiting for him downstairs, who are clearly in a very horrible mood towards him, and that doesn't make him happy. At one point, Louise manages to get down 1 floor below using such a makeshift rope and climb through a window. Louise's classmates are wildly shocked at how skillful he has it. He tells them that they can also go down. The classmates, meanwhile, had moved to the 3rd floor, and Louise himself began checking out the study and hallway. In the moment, Louise talks about one monster he spotted and shows it to his classmates. They take notice. Louise talks about how their main goal now is to get rid of this monster very quickly, carefully and safely. The monster, meanwhile, stands near the next door and tries to break through it with its paws to eat the people inside the office. However, in the moment, Louise along with her classmates abruptly begin their attack on the monster. Louise expectedly attacks first. He hits a pretty strong and massive punch right at his opponent with tremendous power. Right after that, the rest of the guys also decide to join in on this and start delivering powerful blows to the monster's body. After a while, the guys make it through. Louise talks about how this is just the beginning and asks them to help save people. Louise starts banging on the door and asking if anyone is there, informing them that they have eliminated the monster. The glass of the door is ajar by a kid in glasses who asks Louise where he suggests they evacuate to at a time like this. Louise starts lying about how they built a defensive line here not too far away and beat everyone around them. However, the guy with the glasses talks about how all the monsters have gathered on many floors, and they should get to the 5th floor somehow. Louise declares that they have thought of everything here as well, and talks about how they made a rope from the 5th floor. However, the guy with the glasses points to his classmates, and says that there are 20 of them, and it's unlikely that all of them will be able to climb. Louise is in wild shock. He didn't expect that there would be so many people and that the guy with glasses would be so familiar with the situation around him. The kid with the glasses talks about how grateful he is for Louise's help, but his plan is clearly not going to work in this situation. Louise and her friends begin to discuss further action, but at one point one of them points his finger forward. All the guys look ahead down the hallway and notices an enemy there, namely a huge monster looking at them. At one point, this monster breaks loose and starts running straight at Louise and the rest of the guys at high speed. Louise yells at the guys about not being afraid to fight him and talks about how this monster is only one. However, some guys immediately start running away. They talk about how they've had enough and they don't want to continue any longer. The guy who decided to run away runs into a neighboring classroom and starts trying to get back to the 5th floor on a rope. However, this doesn't help him much as the monster is already behind him and immediately ran after him instead of the crowd. Louise's classmate gets really scared. He takes a leap, grabs the rope and starts flying out the window on it. However, such actions clearly don't stop his new monster opponent, who is also jumping. The monster jumps through the window right behind these guys and abruptly bites him on the body and starts squeezing him in its jaws. The other guys inform Louise that the other monsters are also already here, as they were attracted by the sound. Louise also notices that this guy's actions have left them without a rope, and there's no way to get back on it. Louise's classmates report that 3 more monsters have come from the direction of the stairs and are already looming. In the moment, the same guy with glasses abruptly opens the door and yells at Louise and his boys about coming into their classroom. The monster runs after Louise and his friends. The kids in the class ask them to speed up so they can get to class. The monsters, meanwhile, are getting bigger. This one is joined by 2 more who are right behind him. Our guys manage to close the doors firmly against the monsters, but those in turn are very strong and break through the glass. Louise gets all the guys to be more confident and hold the doors tighter so the monster definitely doesn't get in. One of the monsters breaks through the defenses a bit using the door in the doorway and practically grabs Louise. Much to our dismay, this huge monster breaks through the backstage area of our boys and enters the classroom. However, our guys don't decide to give up. They try to contain the onslaught of monsters and kick them out the door. The girls in the class, meanwhile, can't believe what's happening. They huddle all together and just sit there in shock. In a moment, a much larger monster appears outside the classroom, and in one fell swoop, he kicks the door to the room open. All the guys start screaming and crying in shock. They are literally ready to give up their lives and run away. However, apparently the situation is not as sad as it seems at first glance, because our main character, Oscar, appears. Oscar pulls out his sword with a smile and talks about how there will now be one less big monster in the world. At one point, Oscar starts talking loudly to the entire hallway about this huge monster coming to play with him. Those words, of course, attract all the monsters around, not just the big guy, and they all go berserk. However, this all clearly doesn't bother our hero Oscar. He starts running straight at them and fighting each of them with great force. Immediately afterward, Oscar creates huge beams of energy that spread to everything around him. These rays act very badly and negatively on all the monsters around, who try not to look at the bright light. The guys around him ask Louis about what's going on in the hallway right now, but he says he doesn't know himself. Meanwhile, Oscar slays all the opponents in his path and reaches the strongest one on the floor. The monster, which is strong and standing right in front of Oscar, abruptly snaps out of his seat and heads straight for him at breakneck speed. However, Oscar isn't intimidated by this at all. He quickly whizzes right by the monster and slays it with his sword. Oscar continues to fight this monster because such a huge opponent will be difficult to defeat in a couple of blows. However, after a few more blows, our hero manages to fight against the monster and he falls to the floor. Immediately afterward, the kids in the class cheer mightily as they see Oscar take the monster's life in an instant. Louise immediately starts running right at Oscar and jumping around talking about how he's a great savior. Louise falls on our hero's shoulders and starts crying and talking about how he already thought he was going to die here. A guy in glasses turns to our hero and says that this world for him has become much more interesting than before. Immediately afterward, the guy with the glasses grabs the blood, takes Oscara's hand, and introduces her as Danielle. Oscar turns to Louise and asks about where those who are kind of monsters and kind of regular people are now. Louise explains and tells everything that happened, and our hero starts to praise him, much to Louise's delight. Oscar starts walking forward with everyone, and talks about how it would be good to get everyone to safety. Oscar is contacted by Jessica, who informs him that the main monster has hidden in the woods and it is unclear where he is. Oscar realizes that this is a terrible situation for them all, and until they destroy the main monster, the incident could happen again. Jessica also reports that the ring space is still in effect, and Amelia is trying to track the monster's tracks. Jessica also reveals that the chapter, along with her deputy, dug through the archives and learned some details about the monster. Jessica talks about how this monster gets along very well with people and easily falls in with them. Immediately afterward, the monster attacks the victim and injects a snake seed into them, making them its subordinates. And the main goal of this monster is to replace all of humanity, thus making everyone his servants. Oscar finishes talking to Jessica and turns to a guy named Daniel, asking if there's anything he can do to help him. Oscar talks about how if the questions are about superpowers or heroes, he won't answer. However, Danielle asks about how long it's been since such monsters have consisted among ordinary people in such a place. Our hero Oscar speaks the truth and tells us that monsters often lurk among ordinary people and attack at terrible times. Daniel talks about thinking about it and realizing that someone is clearly always guarding them at night, meaning the night watch. Our hero Oscar notices that Daniel wasn't surprised at all after all the information, so he asks if he was surprised or scared. However, Daniel only smiles big and asks Oscar about why he should be afraid all of a sudden. Daniel talks about how he just recently completed his master's degree in chemistry and living things. Daniel begins to approach Oscar and ask him to let him take some parts of the monsters with him to study. Oscar starts to walk away and talks about how he doesn't have time for this because there's still 5 floors to evacuate. In the moment, Oscar is approached by Louise, who says that he and his posse will go with Oscar and that they won't get in the way. After hearing the proposal, Oscar begins to think that this would be a really good thing because his strength is running out. Oscar turns to them and talks about accepting their offer to join forces. Danielle yells about wanting to go too. Louise looks at Daniel in surprise, and Daniel himself starts talking about how he can help analyze all the monsters. Louise tells Oscar that Daniel is indeed a very smart couple and is unlikely to get in the way, after which he is accepted into the team. The events of our story are transferred to the very guy who was in love with his classmate. He is trying to break some door. Behind that door is that same classmate. The kid talks about how he's sure to rescue her from the lockdown now. However, by the time he goes back to break down the door, you can see that the girl is a monster and she wants to eat him. After a while, he manages to crack the door. He opens it abruptly and starts holding the girl outside the door. In the moment, this girl is about to become a monster and attack. However, something distracts her greatly and prevents her from doing so. The monster girl decides to hug the kid next to her. She does so and talks about how she's scared to be here. The kid grabs her hand and starts running forward with her, talking about how of course he's going to save her. However, the monster girl at this point realizes that this is just a great chance for a backhanded attack and prepares herself already. In the moment, the guys run over to one of the classrooms and the nearby students start yelling at the kid, asking why he let her out. The kid starts defending the monster girl and talking about how he just wants to save her because he loves her so much. He also starts threatening them all with a fight, saying that they're keeping her here illegally and it can't be done that way. However, their dialogue is abruptly interrupted by a huge monster running and jumping right over the girl and this guy. All the guys together start running back to the classroom, saying that fighting the monster is impossible right now. However, the monster is not going to back down. He runs right after them, his victim talking about how he hasn't finished his show yet. But at one point, the situation is saved by the appearance of our hero Oscar, who bursts into the battle and saves the guy. In an instant, Oscar removes the head of this monster, which creates a very safe environment for the couple. Louise and Danielle walk behind him and tell Oscar that he looks pretty damn cool with that sword and techniques. Oscar begins to go to the very infected girl. However, her boyfriend prevents him by saying that he won't allow it. However, Oscar turns to this lovesick guy and tells him that he is free to go and he has no questions. The guys start to leave. Louise asks Oscar if there are any monsters among them, but Oscar states that he didn't feel any. Oscar turns to Louise and his team, talking about taking the guys to the assembly hall where they can leave. Louise leaves, but at that moment Oscar is visited by Daniel, who talks about finding something in the meantime. Oscar is greatly surprised by his story and asks if he is sure, but he states that he is not completely sure. Daniel talks about the urgency of taking Oscar's gun to test his theory, which surprises our hero, of course. Oscar gives the gun to Daniel and tells him to go to the gym, and he will try to find the snake's body himself. Meanwhile, Louise is walking down the hall, leading everyone into the assembly hall and talking about how cool Oscar is and killed the monster easily. Oscar, meanwhile, is running down the hall. He stops and calls someone asking if they've seen everything. It turns out to be a sniper. He talks about seeing everything, and he also blabs that the 2 students went towards the north. The sniper tells, and further where they went, our hero Oscar realizes what the place is and moves out there. Oscar gets to the spot he thought he was at in the moment and informs the sniper that apparently he has found a body. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to the very same couple, a guy named Richard and a girl named Betty. In the moment, Betty beckons Richard over to her and asks him to have fun with her and starts hugging him. In the moment, Betty starts kissing Richard and then in a flashback becomes a huge monster that attacks Richard. Meanwhile, this whole situation is being watched by our hero Oscar, who overhears everything that is going on. Richard is becoming a monster by this point and starts screaming like a wild animal. Oscar understands. He runs into the room and immediately wipes out Richard with one swing, bringing him to his knees. Oscar starts walking further into the room he got into and tries to find the very girl Betty, who is a monster. Upon entering the room, our hero is immediately told that he is the only descendant of the monster left alive in the school. Oscar walks further into the room and tries to figure out where his opponent is, and a monster jumps down from behind him, blocking the exit. Using Betty's monster, the most important monster tells Oscar that she has nothing to talk about with a member of the Night Watch. With great composure, Oscar sits down near the piano and talks about how he doesn't understand at all then why the one spoke. Oscar begins to ask the monster why he, with his disguise skills, didn't just become a regular person and just live life. Monster Girl talks about how reproduction is an instinct in their race, and humans need to be aware of it. Oscar wonders, and talks about how it is impossible for a creature of such high intelligence to suppress trivial biological desires. Monster turns to Oscar and talks about how if the latter likes talking so much, she also wants to ask one question. Monster Girl starts talking about how if she infects Oscar now, she could paralyze the entire Night Watch of the city, right? Oscar ponders the fact that whether this girl is a monster decided to make a trap for him. It pisses him off. In the next instant after Oscar thought this, the monster abruptly snapped out of his seat and started flying at him. Our hero Oscar of course notices this and realizes it's worth acting on and easily dodges it. However, as it turns out, the monster's attack was much more powerful. It began to reveal some sort of flower in its body. Immediately after, Oscar's opponent started throwing massive punches with that body part right at Oscar, which surprised him. Oscar turns to her and asks about the fact that she told him she had a very weak body after all, and now she's showing that level. However, Oscar also realizes the real danger now and decides to run forward, opting for a small tactical retreat. However, the monster is still chasing him and won't let him get away. Oscar runs away with all his might, but it turns out to be obviously very weak. In the moment, he stops and begins to create a huge circle around himself, making a field of energy. However, such actions do not surprise the monster girl at all. She immediately decides to attack with her power body part. These attacks are quite strong and massive, however. Oscar manages to dodge them and plan counterattacks into his opponent. In the moment, Oscar snaps out of it and starts running straight at his opponent, deciding to strike back. Though Oscar manages to make it a little bit, however, with a huge and massive punch, the girl monster tosses Oscar aside. The impact on Oscar was very strong. Yes, so much so that he was just thrown out of the building at great speed into the street. Oscar started flying down right out of the window of this building, realizing that the situation was pretty dire for him, and it was worth doing something about. However, right at that moment, a huge spear completely covered in fire appears overhead and flies straight at the monster. It turns out to be Jessica, who didn't leave Oscar in such trouble and immediately came to his rescue. However, Oscar is still flying down, but relaxes a lot because he believes that Jessica will catch him like in the movie. However, Jessica decides to catch her spear instead of Oscar's and save it, while Amelia nearby watches Oscar fall downward. Oscar sees this and starts screaming. And a second later, Jessica's decision causes him to fall right into the leaves. Amelia in turn stands nearby in wild shock, and Jessica just looks at Oscar like he's a chump. Jessica asks Oscar if he's okay. He replies that he's fine, and Amelia stands nearby in wild shock. Jessica looks at everything around her and talks about how it's a snake demon after all, just one measly opponent. Oscar's adversary in turn doesn't stand still, but mutates into a new form and starts looking at Oscar and Jessica. However, in the very next second, she abruptly starts to run away and flies straight into the nearest window, shattering it. Oscar, along with Jessica, begin discussing amongst themselves what they should do and realize that the enemy is leaving. Jessica talks about how she doesn't see a problem at all, as she doesn't like bugs scattering and picks up the aura of fire. Immediately afterward, Jessica snaps out of her seat and starts running straight at her opponent with a charge of fire in her spear. Jessica starts to do an upward leap and swings her spear of fire to throw it at the monster's trail. With a rather sweet face, Jessica turns quietly to the monster and talks about saying goodbye to his life. In the next instant after that, Jessica throws her spear forward with tremendous speed. The spear flies at tremendous speed straight into the building, and a series of explosions from the sheer energy begins. After a couple minutes, Jessica finds the corpse of the monster and talks about how that's the end of it. She destroyed it in one fell swoop. Jessica starts yawning and talking about how she thought it would be more interesting, however. Oscar wonders what she thought at all. Jessica turns to Oscar and asks him not to be sad and talks about treating him to dinner tonight, while Amelia is in the back taking pictures. Oscar is standing near the corpse, looking at it and thinking about something, and Jessica asks Amelie about what she's filming there. Meanwhile, the events of our story move to the assembly hall, where all those kids who are still in school are. Daniel approaches Louise and asks about the name of the organization Oscar is a member of, who replies that it is the Night Watch. Immediately afterward, Louise talks about how Daniel now needs to purge his memory, which scares him a lot. Louise starts joking around and talking about how the Night Watch has a device that clears the memory of those who know a lot about them. Daniel asks what about Louis himself then, but he says that he's about to become a member of the Night Watch. Daniel asks about the conditions for joining the Night Watch, and Louise asks if Daniel has also decided to do so. Oscar enters the room to announce that the mission is complete and they have defeated the monster along with Jessica. Louise runs up to Oscar and talks about how he's made a huge contribution and whether he can join the watch now, but Oscar says he can be. However, in a moment, from behind, Louise announces Daniel, who fires several powerful blasts directly at Louise. Daniel ignores Louise's words and continues to fire powerful pistol shots at his head. Finding himself with 3 holes in his head, Louise turns around and asks Daniel why he's taking shots at him. But in a moment, Louise realizes the whole situation. He grabs his head and begins to wonder why he didn't die from the gunshots. Louise begins to tremble. He turns to Oscar and asks about the fact that he has now awakened all of his sentinel powers. However, Oscar states with a cold face that Louise is the snake demon everyone is talking about. Oscar looks directly at Louis and talks about what is only one part of him to be exact, and pulls out his sword. In the moment, our hero grabs Louise by his clothes and tells him about looking directly into his eyes. Immediately afterward, their gazes make contact, and the soul begins to leave Louise's body with Oscar's aura. Immediately afterward, Louise starts to fall to the ground. Aura walks away, and Oscar grabs him and holds him in his arms. However, in the moment, Louise becomes a monster, grabs Oscar's hand and asks the man how he knew about all this. Oscar removes his hand, and Louise talks about how on Oscar's level it's still impossible to see through his mask. Oscar pulls out his sword again and talks about how he really didn't see anything, but the sheer number of mistakes led him to that conclusion. Daniel enters the dialogue and starts talking about how he also suspected a lot of things when he was watching Louise. One such point was that there were many injured people on the 3rd floor, yet the monsters didn't attack them. Daniel also picked up on the fact that when the monster jumped from the window behind the man, it felt as if its goal was to cut the rope, not to kill. Daniel also realized that the second part of Louise's plan was to get close to Oscar in order to be close to him at all times. Oscar talks about how he realized everything then, because Louise created a second personality to get close to Oscar. Louise is now standing there just looking directly at Oscar and Daniel with a very disgruntled face, not sure what he should do. Oscar tells us that they knew at once that the snake demon had been among the people for a long time. Oscar also says that they also knew that this demon is highly intelligent and understands people's actions. And next, in describing the demon and Louise himself, Oscar suggests that this is how Louise came into the world. Oscar also tells us that most likely because of the incident with the Ghost King, the snake demon became afraid of the Sentinel and decided to defeat them. Demon Louise starts clapping his hands and talking about how Oscar really surprised him with his knowledge. In the next instant after that, Louise turns into a huge monster and attacks Oscar directly. However, such actions on the part of Louise do not scare our hero at all. He stands on 2 legs and faces Louise's monster. Immediately afterward, Oscar's sword and Louise's paw come together in a clash, and a strong fight ensues between them. Oscar is going side to side and trying to figure out his opponent's moves so he can attack him well. And in an instant, Oscar manages to do so. He immediately lands a rather sharp and massive punch to the face of his opponent. Having deprived the monster Louise of his sight, Oscar makes a strong jump upwards to cut off the monster's head and accomplishes his task. Oscar stands by Louise's dead head and talks about how they're finally done with him after all this time. Meanwhile, the squad leader and his deputy between discuss the fact that it would be nice to celebrate Louise's first successful mission somehow. The squad leader suggests baking some kind of specialty cake or making a nice huge banner. Zam talks to the chapter about acting like a parent whose kid is going to college, and it's funny. Meanwhile, the police surround the area, and Oscar, Amelia, and Jessica go to the rest of their squad. The head of the squad turns to Oscar quite nicely and asks how he's feeling. He replies that he's fine. Upon hearing this question, Jessica starts yelling at the captain and asking him about why he didn't ask her the same question. However, at one point, some uniformed man runs up to our heroes and asks them to wait, saying there's a problem. The worker begins to tell us that when they started cleaning up, the monster's head disappeared somewhere. Our hero Oscar also hears all this. He gets out of the car and heads to the worker to understand the whole situation. Apparently, the head of the snake monster was missing for a reason, and it was stolen by Daniel. Daniel begins to realize that there may be a big hunt for him, and he starts to think about hiding in the hatch. As it happens, Daniel stole the head of the serpent dragon and began hiding somewhere underground. Daniel reaches his head out, grasps it, and in a moment he notices that he can see the bones of his arm, and his eyes glow green. Daniel screams about how it's just a great feeling. He says he's finally mastered her. Meanwhile, Louise wakes up in the very same dungeon in the hospital that is in our hero Oscar's dream. Louise doesn't realize where he is. He starts breaking down the door and realizes that things are really bad, and he doesn't know where he is. In the moment, Louise falls to the ground. He grabs his head and starts sweating, talking about how his head hurts a lot. Louise begins to have visions in his head of the very people he killed while he was a monster. In the moment, our hero Oscar walks up to that very cage. He starts looking directly at Louise, who is in shock. Louise starts to get very angry with Oscar. He screams and swings, making attempts to destroy the cage around him. Louise begins to yell at Oscar again, but the latter only responds by saying that he has already chosen a fate for Louise. Louise starts to push pity and talks about how if Oscar kills him, Daniel will also die. However, in response to this, our hero only smiles and says that he generally doesn't care about it. Louise realizes that he has no chance and begins to press on pity, telling about his hidden abilities. He takes a long time to list all his skills, and our hero asks him if he has anything more worthwhile to offer. Oscar quietly turns to Louise and asks him if he ever took care of mentally ill old ladies. He says no. Oscar says that there is generally one option that Louise can stay, and that is the labor contract they will enter into. Immediately after signing the contract, the aura around Louis changes, and he becomes a #1 doctor's outfit as a nurse. Oscar asks Louise how he feels about the suit. He says it's pretty good. Immediately afterward, the events of the story take us to the hospital courtyard, and Oscar tells Louise about Anfisa and her problems. Immediately afterward, they head to Anfisa herself, who is delighted to bits when she sees Oscar. Oscar tries to gently explain to Anfisa the fact that he has found a man to follow her, which surprises her greatly. Anfisa sits with a very pensive face. She looks at Oscar and can't understand anything. Louise is getting scared by this time. In the moment, Anfisa starts yelling at Louise like he's her grandson and talking about how Grandma finally found him. Louise immediately realizes what's going on. He comes up to her and tells her that he also misses her very much. Oscar, meanwhile, walks the halls and reflects on the fact that he's been socializing with Anfisa for a month, and it has taken its toll. In his spare time, our hero also practices special techniques in order to control himself and power. His shooting and bullet dodging skills have improved the best. In this, he is now simply a master. However, his skills are better than a human, but definitely not better than the other squad members, especially the sniper. Some time passes and a new recruitment begins in the watch circles. Our hero suggests that they may go to another city for training. Apparently so, because the head of the squad gives Jessica instructions on how to purchase goods for the road. The events of our story carry over to a full-blown guy named Charlie who is in a massage parlor. His manager approaches and informs him that he has received an invitation to a neighboring town in the east of the country. In the moment, Charlie throws out this invitation and afterward asks to book him tickets, talking about flying him there tomorrow. He starts walking down the hallway, talking about how if Master Lucas himself invites him, he's definitely going there. Meanwhile, the events of our story take us to the very same Master Lucas, who sits with his pipe and meditates. However, the whole process of his meditation is interrupted by the appearance of some old man who informs him that Lukao has received a letter. Lucas is surprised to see that it is a letter from Charlie. He goes to his foreman and asks for an opinion on the letter. The master says that in his 5 years in the temple, Lucas has clearly suppressed all his evil and can generally go to a meeting. Lucas asks about his sins, but the master tells him that it doesn't matter much because it will never be completely washed away. Lucas starts to leave and thank the master, but the master says he would like to remind him of one thing before he leaves. The master talks about Lucas having a chance to meet an honorable man during the trip, and this surprises him greatly. The events of our story shift to Oscar, Amelia, and Jessica walking around the store very happy except for a tired Oscar. Together, they try to pick out a cool suitcase to take on the road, and Oscar is just in shock and doesn't understand why they would waste so much time. Jessica suggests besides that also to buy a backpack with a princess, and Amelia of course agrees with her. Jessica and Amelia start to look at cute dresses, but Oscar stops them, telling them that they'd better pick something else. From that moment, time moves forward again, and Oscar, with all his belongings and pink suitcase, stands at the train station. The deputy head turns to him and asks if he has taken everything he needs with him. Oscar says he is ready for everything and has taken everything. Jessica talks about getting the right creams and gels for Oscar and asks her to remember to use them. The head instructs our hero and asks him not to worry. He says he can handle everything. Oscar walks off ahead, saying that it's time for him to go and he'll try to get back quickly, the guys from the squad seeing him off. While everyone is seeing Oscar off in the moment, someone calls the chapter's cell phone and says something sharply. The head snaps out of his seat and yells about stopping Oscar immediately and says that the training has been moved to another city. The boys all start running forward together in an attempt to stop our hero Oscar from leaving town. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to some unknown large ship at sea. Something very important is clearly happening on this ship, as a lot of rich people are inside having dinner. However, at one point, the ship starts to shake very violently, which is clearly not like normal waves. And it's true for a reason, as some huge chushals begin to encompass the ship in a circle on all sides. It turns out to be some huge monster. It wraps itself around the entire ship and starts trying to eat it. Using the engine, the ship makes attempts to break free. However, this does not end well. All the people inside are shaking. Meanwhile, the monster doesn't stop. It tries to take over the ship right as it approaches a major night city. In a moment, the monster decides that the best and most successful strategy for him would be to simply consume all the water around him. However, a huge, powerful beam whizzes by nearby and knocks down everything in its path, slicing through everything around it. This huge beam of energy and light strikes the monster from a great distance and clearly injures it severely. It also turns out that someone is watching the monster from far away and trying to hunt it down from a distance. Some person with binoculars says that their boss's technique is only getting more powerful because that monster died from a single hit. A masked guy sits next to the girl who was looking through binoculars and asks her to rate his shot. Another kid nearby turns to them and talks about heading back to camp in time to finish with the defense. The guys are in no hurry to agree with him and follow him to the camp, but he talks about how this is an official order from above. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to a kid in the woods who can't find where to go. This guy is being followed through the scopes. The tracker informs someone that the person is approaching already. Meanwhile, this man with a pink suitcase and backpack reaches some huge doors and starts looking at them. Some man in uniform opens the door for him and asks who he is. The guy replies that he's a rookie Jake. The man ushers him inside and tells him that he's the first to arrive, and it's still a couple days before training begins. The man asks to be called simply instructor, for that is what he is in this boot camp for recruits. The instructor begins to do a tour of the area for Jake, first showing a runway for military flying equipment. Next, he shows off a building that few people like, for it is where theory classes for second years are held. To the side of them are abandoned buildings. There are various tests and maneuvers taking place there. The instructor also shows Jake a place to shoot, talking about how important it is for a sentinel to be able to shoot. Jake is surprised, thinking to himself that the place used to be a wasteland, but they just built such a huge firing range. Jake asks the instructor why all the workers are looking at him. The instructor says that messengers of the gods are a rarity for this place. Jake is greatly surprised and asks about how there have never been messengers here before him. The instructor says that as he knows, the last messenger of the gods who left their training ground became the leader of the group, the Masks. Some man nearby turns to Jake and talks about how he was expecting a very poncy guy, and Jake seems okay. This man also suggests that in addition to the messenger of the gods, some very powerful guys with forbidden runes will also be arriving this year. In the moment, the man who reads the pledges is surprised to see one girl's name, Belly. He says he didn't expect her to show up. The events of the story move forward and Jake goes to his room, noticing that his blanket is a little torn. However, in a moment, the door to his room opens abruptly. It's done by a huge guy in glasses and a suit. A few more of these men come in next, carrying huge suitcases of stuff, saying they brought it for the young master. That same guy, Charlie, walks into the room, along with his manager, who is forever suggesting that we go home. However, Charlie once again refuses, saying that he came here to study and will do it no matter what. In the moment, Charlie's manager notices Jake's stuff and asks him to get rid of it, saying it's in Charlie's way. Jake talks about wanting to see whoever dares to touch his stuff, but Charlie's guards ignore him and do it. Jake abruptly gets right in front of them and smiles, realizing that he's going to have to act very powerfully now. However, at one point Charlie runs up to him, happily grabs his hand and tells him that Jake is his little brother, surprising everyone. Charles's assistant gets into their dialogue and tries to talk him out of being friends with Jake now. However, upon hearing such a suggestion, Charles just abruptly tosses his assistant aside in a moment. Immediately afterward, Charles turns to the guards and asks them to bring the gifts he has prepared for his neighbor. Jake starts looking at the things in the drawers, while Charles chases the guards away, saying this isn't their room. Afterwards, Charles says he forgot to introduce himself, apologizes for everything, and asks to just be called Charlie or Chubby. In the moment, Charlie talks about his family being in the watch business. He immediately recognized that from the gifts. Charlie talks about how his family is actually very humble, even though they are in business in many industries at once. 2 days have passed since that moment, and Jake stands brushing his teeth, reflecting on the fact that Charlie manages to hide his origins well. However, when Jake walks out into the hallway, he notices that Charlie is busy handing out presents, namely a lot of watches. But in a moment, the military gets involved in all of this, and they criticize Charlie and talk about how no fairs should be held here. The military scolds everyone, including Charlie, but suggests that they are willing to forgive such insolence for the first time. The events of the story are carried forward, with one of the generals giving speeches to all the cadets in the Corps. He tells the norms, rules, and tasks, but one of the guys raises his hand and talks about how he's not happy. Hearing this, the other guys also riot. Charlie asks Jake what the main reason for the riot is then. And the one explains that if you follow such methods, they will all be nothing but pathetic bugs in the eyes of the monster. After listening to everyone, the general talks about how if many people disagree with his decision, he will give them all a chance. He talks about the chance of realizing who they all are in this society, and at that moment some plane flies overhead. In this airplane flies the very same group of people in special masks, who eat and grill shish kebab right there. One of them talks about getting the signal to get ready to disembark, but the other argues with him, saying they haven't eaten yet. However, their argument ends very quickly, because in a moment they all fall down at great speed along with the kebab. People from below notice them and yell that some kind of disaster is happening, but this group flies along in perfect calm. Immediately afterward, a group of masked men land right where the cadets are practicing and discussing. One of them, the leader, addresses everyone and says that they are a masked faction and they are happy to see all the new recruits. Immediately afterward, one of them falls right at the feet of the new recruits on the ground, surprising everyone else around them. Immediately afterward, he rises abruptly and introduces his squad, but his partners have only shame. Charlie tells Jake that these people are very polite as for members of such a powerful squad, but he says it's about something else. Looking at the squad members, the general talks about how our recruits need to unmask one of the squad members before nightfall. Looking at everyone, the general also talks about how he can, for once, without any jokes, very quickly file a document to expel anyone. After that, the general starts saying some very motivating things, but adds that all the recruits are still just nothing. One of the recruits strongly objects, and talks about how the members of Muska's squad are very strong, and they can't handle them. However, the general replies that the actual battlefield and monsters are also very unfair in this world. But the head of the Musk faction declares that they will suppress all their forces for the duration of this ordeal. Abruptly, Jake intervenes in the dialogue, turning to the masked members and asking when it's okay to start. The Musk leader responds by saying that the ordeal for them has already begun, and therefore for the recruits itself as well. Immediately afterward, Charlie abruptly unleashes a huge fire attack right in the direction where the masked squad members were standing. The other guys among the recruits are also starting to activate their abilities and talk about being ready. However, Jake at one point grabs Charlie and runs away, saying that if they go on the offense now, they'll just die. Jake takes Charlie by the hand and talks about how they need to learn all of their abilities and powers first, and then attack. Meanwhile, the guys who launched the attack are standing around rejoicing, saying that they have already defeated this unit with their own forces. The guys keep laughing with them and talking about how those were obviously very weak, but the chubby guy turns his attention forward. And there's one of the masked members standing up front talking about how the recruits almost hit him, but he was more careful. In the moment, there is an explosion created by a girl with pink hair named Lily. Meanwhile, in the control room, they discuss the fact that many recruits were very overrated and in fact fell off in one fight. Many in the military discuss the fact that even with a very suppressed force, the masked group poses a huge threat. However, with a big smile, the army's top general intervenes in their dialogue and says it's all very interesting. The general says that in this way, the stupid and the clever can be selected at once from each other, which will be efficient. However, the general also says that as long as they fight one of the leaders of the masked faction, they can't win. Yes, and besides the leader himself, there are a lot of strong and powerful people in the masked faction. Meanwhile, Jake along with his friend Charlie make it to a certain place pretty tired. Charlie is very surprised to see that the door to the weapons hangar is closed, but Jake realizes that no one is going to give them weapons for nothing. Charlie is very frightened. He knocks on the door hoping someone will open it, while Jake is at this moment wondering what material the door is made of. In the moment, Jake addresses Charlie directly and talks about how his rune doesn't have much irritability, but Charlie's rune might. However, Charlie replies that he doesn't even have one forbidden rune. Much to Jake's surprise, he doesn't understand how Charlie got on the watch. However, in a moment right next to Jake and Charlie, some girl appears. She says she can open the doors. Immediately after that, she does use some strong energy that spreads around. Immediately after that, the whole door abruptly collapsed and this girl started walking forward. Jake was greatly surprised at her strength. In the moment, Jake turns to her and asks about the rune she used for such power, which catches her attention. She asks Jake about why she has to talk about it, and Jake says she wants to win like everyone else, right? She smiles and asks Jake that does her answer really determine whether she wins or not. At that moment, Jake uses his power and brings a beam of energy practically to her face. However, it turns out that it's not Jake's sword at all, but some other guy attacking the guys. It turns out to be one of the members of the mask squad, who takes aim at our guys and is very surprised that they noticed him. Trace also talks about how he came across apparently strong guys, judging by their aura. That crimson-haired girl doesn't dare to just stand there and chat. She goes directly to attack. With her first swing of her blade, she unleashes a bolt of energy that slices through her opponent's arm. Charlie is immediately overjoyed, thinking they've managed to take down one of the masked men. But Jake says it's not that simple. In the moment, one of the masked faction members uses his powers, through which he manages to heal his arm. Our hero talks about how he probably used a trick of the light. The man responds by saying he'll get rid of the girl first. However, in the moment, right in that hangar where all this was happening, there is a very powerful explosion that blows everything around it away. These turn out to be the same guys recruits say they can't pass up an opportunity like this. Of course, the guy in the mask reacts violently to all this and jumps right into their direction, throwing punches. However, in the moment, one of the masked guys feels a very strong pressure on himself, realizing that this is the power of a messenger of the gods. Immediately afterward, the masked guy and the guy next to him are pitted in a duel against each other. Everyone else is just standing around in wild shock because they didn't expect the outcome of the battle to be just like this for them. However, in a moment, all the firearms the guys had in their hands began to rise upward at a tremendous rate. Two more members from Muskie's organization appear nearby, one of whom says that the mice have finally left the burrows. The purple-haired guy returns to his squad, saying they're right on time, as there's a messenger of the gods here. The crimson-haired girl suggests that Jake and Charlie start fighting an opponent, but Charlie says that's silly right now. Members of the Masks organization are reaching out to everyone, telling them to stop running and let themselves be defeated already. Jake, meanwhile, turns to the girl next to him and says that his plan is for her to break the wall now. In the moment, Jake makes a complete show of being ready to fight and talks about them all attacking him. Apparently, the members of the Mask organization take this all very seriously. They really get into a special fighting stance. Immediately afterward, Jack signals the girl next to him to break down the wall standing next to him, and she raises a charge of energy. The girl manages to do it, and the guys immediately see that they have a way to retreat and run there all together. However, one of the squad members doesn't decide to just let them go. He immediately creates an aura of energy and sends a weapon at the guys. In the moment, the guys turn around and realize that they now have a huge and powerful gun trail behind them, and it's worth cleaning up. The squad girl named Lily abruptly raises her aura of power and creates a huge pink-colored hammer, striking the floor with it. It moves from place to place and suggests that they have no chance of escape now. Charlie at this point stands there in shock and does nothing. Jake runs right up to him and grabs him and starts to carry him away afterward. Charlie asks why they're running to the gate if they broke the wall, but Jake says it's just a distraction. A girl named Nami notices all this and starts running right behind our guys right away. The squad guy stands pondering what to do: run after the 4 strong ones or stop the Arava of the weak ones. The head of the organization talks about not worrying and leaving it to him, after which he immediately snaps out of it. The head of the masked organization runs right behind the car our guys ran to, but in a moment he notices something abruptly. It turns out to be a grenade explosive device that abruptly detonated and exploded. The rest of the masked organization immediately went to the site of the explosion and began to analyze how the explosion occurred. The head of the organization survived, but he strongly complains that he was very close to death because of ordinary recruits. The leader of the organization also fixes her mask, saying that it's good to see that they weren't able to hurt her. Meanwhile, the people at HQ are discussing Jake's actions and being able to hit one of the masked group members. A member of the staff tells him that underneath Jake's face is a Night Watch guy with the powers of a god named Oscar. Meanwhile, Oscar, who was previously pretending to be another guy, sits with Nami and watches the other's actions. Charlie asks Oscar about what happened after the explosion and if they were able to defeat the leader of the Masks. Oscar says he's not sure about that. Their dialogue is interrupted by Nami. She presents in front of Oscar and reveals her powers. Oscar in return does the same. Nami asks Oscar about why he tricked the other guys with the wall trick and decided to run away himself. Oscar responds to Nami by saying that those guys wouldn't have been able to escape anyway, but 3 people could. Oscar also describes the strategy and methodology of Muskie's faction, explaining why the decision was a wise one. Charlie talks about how, if Oscar's words are to be believed, the Mask Squad is so strong that they have almost no chance. In response, Oscar talks about how as long as they're in the game, chances are, and he oodles of people were able to recognize one critical weakness. The events of the story return to the grouping of masks. Among themselves, they discuss the decision to move to the dormitory. One of the squad members says it's worth acting together, since the other recruits have already banded together throughout the camp. Meanwhile, Oscar sits on the floor and starts telling Charlie, along with Nami, his opinion of the Mask's plans. Looking up at the sky, Oscar talks about how few people are a disadvantage to them, but for our guys it's a plus. The leader of the Musk group, meanwhile, says the same thing. So they decide to eliminate large groups of recruits. Time was moving forward. Some guys were discussing amongst themselves tactics to fight the Masks, but one of them refused to participate. However, in a moment, their dialogue was abruptly interrupted by the fact that the sword of one of the masked members flew straight into this room. The guy who called him returns to the rooftop, and with the rest of the guys discusses a plan of action. This kid complains to their local leader that their plan is too simple, but the latter in turn notices something. The leader doesn't pay attention to this and continues to talk about the plan as a member of the Masks appears in the moment from behind. The guys start praising their captain, and this masked member gets into their atmosphere and criticizes him. A member of the Musk group begins to criticize the guy's plan for the sheer number of holes, and they are very surprised to see it. The guys around him decide to attack him from behind together, but he throws them all to the ground in one swing of his weapon. The leader of this local unit realizes that he should act, and preferably quickly, so he creates a sphere of energy. Immediately afterward, this guy makes a tactical expansion of the sphere, thus completely dipping himself in it. Immediately afterward, the sphere began to expand, absorbing one of Muska's faction members into itself. Immediately afterward, the kid turns to him and talks about removing all the air from that sphere. He starts talking about how in this vacuum no one will die instantly, but everyone around him will start to suffer a lot. The young man threatens the masked man that they don't have much left to live for, so they better take off the mask and end it all. However, he gets no answer to his request, only to catch someone's strong sword that flew in his direction. Although he managed to reflect the sword, but to stand against the blob of energy that was thrusting at him was not possible. The masked kid decides not to debate him and immediately throws a few more straight punches. The kid who created the sphere can't stand such severe injuries and damage to himself, from which he flies down at high speed. From such sharp blows, he loses his strength and the sphere disappears. The masked guy criticizes him for such harsh methods. However, the moment the dialogue is interrupted, purple lightning bolts appear on this guy's fingers, followed by a huge explosion. Meanwhile, watching the whole situation around them is Oscar and his comrades in the form of Nami and Charlie sitting nearby. Nami explains to Charlie the fact that they are now biding their time waiting for the leader of the organization to act, as his abilities are still unknown. Oscar cuts into the conversation, saying that everything is right, and on top of that, they probably still have secret weapons. Meanwhile, the masked guys continue to have brutal fights with the recruits right there. The guy with the sphere is chasing one of the gang members, and the guy in turn swats him away with a gun. However, using the power of the sphere, he sends that weapon back at him, then counterattacks immediately. Immediately afterward, a kid named Jerry creates a sphere of energy that immediately explodes. The masked kid dodges the explosions, but Jerry's skills really surprise him in this fight. Jerry turns to the masked guy and good-naturedly tells him the principle of how his spheres and the energies in them work. However, the masked guy stops abruptly and says that even with such abilities, this young man is still weak. Immediately afterwards, special pink hammers abruptly appear right above him and clamp him inside. This turns out to be help from a girl named Lily. She saves her masked partner using the runes of hammers. Afterward, Lily looks directly at Jerry and talks about how he's a pretty dangerous opponent as it turns out. The squad leader also arrives on the scene, saying that apparently Jerry is one of the 3 strongest recruits. However, in a moment, their dialogue is interrupted by the fact that there are sharp whooshes of gunfire and machine guns coming from the windows. The squad immediately takes notice, seeing several people in military uniforms. It turns out to be a group of recruits. They stop abruptly and combine their forces together. Using their combined forces, they create a wall in the dormitory courtyards that blocks the masked group's retreat. Afterward, a squad of these high schoolers was led by the very same guy, Jerry, who started demanding the captain's mask. Members of Muskie's squad talk about how powerful this attack from the recruits really was, but the captain tells them not to worry. One of the squad members asks the captain to spring into action, reminding him that they need to eat a kebab around 6 p.m. The guy's recruits, meanwhile, don't really want to wait. They start shooting down more actively, shouting that victory will be theirs. They even have weapons with missiles in their arsenal, but one of the squad members easily absorbs the shots with his strength. The boys complain about this to Jerry, however. He asks no one to worry, saying that they will work it out. The same guy with the absorption ability tells the captain that he can't last much longer like this, and the captain asks him to stop. That guy's aura disappears, and in its place appears the mysterious power of the masked squad captain. Jerry stands in shock, for he immediately realized what the problem was. Everything around him has slowed down, and that is the power of Captain Masks. Using a pretty strong deceleration, Captain Masks manages to dodge absolutely everything going on around him and pull out his sword. Immediately afterward, with a satisfyingly sharp and powerful attack, he flies forward and knocks down everything in his path with tremendous energy. This is all being watched by our guys they can't believe that this is really the power of one of Captain Masks. Oscar is also surprised, but what amazes him most is that with such incredible power, the Captain of the Masks uses rather trivial tricks. Charlie talks about how he has the power of the rune of the god Kronos, which allows him to control time, and the sword is most likely just a trick. Charlie also talks about how the Force itself isn't much of a threat, but because of the physical attributes of the leader of the masks, it's stronger. Charlie notices the surprised faces of Nami and Oscar and tells them that the blade of the leader of the masks was given to him by Charlie's family. Nami talks about how she can't stand rich men because the richer they are, the worse most of the time. Meanwhile, Lily turns to the captain and asks about whether he's being too harsh on the new recruits, who says he meant well. Lily begins to count the number of recruits destroyed and their strength, realizing that there are clearly not many left. The captain asks everyone to follow him, saying it's time to meet the messenger of the god in the final battle. One of the squad members uses his abilities and talks about how no one can escape them now like they used to. However, some guys among the recruits survived and started to get up right out of the rubble. The guy who managed to survive sits down and asks to be killed, saying that if he reveals himself, no one will survive. But the masked guy only starts laughing in response, saying that it's too much pride for a new recruit to say such a thing. Right off the bat, the masked guy uses his powers and asks the new recruit to try and defend himself against them. However, this is all interrupted by the sudden appearance of some sort of purple beam of energy near the masked guy. This turns out to be Nami, who attacks directly at one of the masked group members with great speed. Oscar also appears nearby and starts dragging the masked guy's opponent behind him. The guy doesn't understand why he's being rescued. Oscar tells this guy the fact that there's a fight here now against the masked faction, and if he doesn't want to participate, he'd better leave. This guy Oscar rescued turns out to be the same Lucas who was predicted by the master to meet the guy who gives happiness. However, Lucas's thoughts are interrupted by a masked guy. He informs him that he got rid of Nami and wants to see Lucas's powers. Lucas pulls out his sword covered in an aura of darkness and asks the masked guy if he's sure he wants a fight. Meanwhile, Oscar and Charlie pull Jerry out from under the rubble and tell him everything that happened. Jerry turns to Oscar and asks why he's so confident in his victory when there's still a huge battle ahead. Meanwhile, Lucas uses his true abilities, creating a simply horrible aura around him, his eyes turning red. Immediately afterward, Lucas snaps out of his seat and charges straight at his masked opponent, attacking him sharply. A pretty powerful fight ensues between the two, in which it's immediately apparent that Lucas is in a position of strength. The masked guy tries to counterattack him, causing a huge ball of energy to go between them. Immediately afterward, there's a massive explosion that hits a lot of things around it, and the masked guy dodges it. The captain of the mask squad enters the fight, saying that he is always ready to help his men in a tough battle. The leader of the masked faction talks about how their opponent Lucas has a pretty strong rune of darkness. He also talks about his rune being on the list of forbidden dark divine runes. The guy who fought against Lucas suggests that he's been very careless before, but now he's going to prove himself. He attacks Lucas directly, but the latter is also ready to attack and starts to defend himself using his power. Meanwhile, the other members of the masked squad discuss amongst themselves that they really need to be more careful. However, right as they are discussing this amongst themselves, Nami appears from behind and flies straight at them with a huge attack. One of the masked squad members immediately takes the entire attack on himself, protecting his partner from attack. He tries to engage in a fight against Nami, however it turns out to be not as easy as he originally thought. Lily also springs into action, talking about how she doesn't understand why recruits are so fond of sneaking up from behind. Meanwhile, Charlie is watching everything going on in the courtyard of the dormitory, looking at the fights through binoculars. But in a moment, a member of the masked faction appears behind him and attacks him, but some sort of barrier interrupts the blow. Immediately afterward, the masked guy makes a few more attempts, but after a while his sword simply breaks. Charlie apologizes to the guy in the mask and says that he is protected by special equipment and it will not be possible to harm him. Immediately afterward, Charlie talks more about his powers, but his enemy doesn't listen to him and just starts activating his abilities. Meanwhile, our hero Oscar enters the fray and heads straight for the leader of the masked factions. The leader of the group turns around abruptly, raises his hand, and says something about how he's been waiting for Oscar to be here for a long time. Meanwhile, the people at HQ are very worried. Their shelter is right under the dormitory courtyard and could get damaged. The HQ think tank is also in shock. They can't understand how all these recruits can fight at such a high level. The general says that he sees only advantages in this, because this way they will be able to create a very strong team in the future. The general also says that it will be possible to make the 5th Battalion of Special Purpose. Meanwhile, the head of the masks turns to Oscar, saying that no matter how the battle ends, he'd be happy to talk afterward anyway. Immediately afterward, the head of the masks creates a huge sphere of energy right above him, as if rays of sunlight were spreading around him. However, Oscar is right beside the head of the masks in just a second and begins to engage in battle with him. In many ways, the head of the masks proves to be faster than Oscar, allowing him to move at a much faster speed through space. Oscar realizes that he's going to take significant hits if left like this, so he decides to pull back rather quickly. Oscar is well aware that if it wasn't for his training in the past, he wouldn't even last 5 seconds with such an opponent now. However, the head of the masks is also not as simple as he seems. He immediately starts coming at Oscar with more attacks. Quickly expending energy, Oscar moves from place to place, trying to hold off his opponent's attacks. At one point, Oscar even manages to make a little attack right into his opponent. Charlie, Nami, and the masked members watch the fight between Oscar and the chapter, which is very fast. One of the masked members suggests that all the recruits take a break and take a breather while the chapter and the others fight. However, their dialogues and musings are interrupted by the loud shouts of Charlie, who asks Oscar to slay his opponent faster. Seeing the kind of support Oscar is getting, the masked guys also start cheering for their captain. The head of the masks tells Oscar that if you listen, his support sounds much louder. Oscar only smirks in response, saying that apparently his opponent has reached the limit of his mental power. Meanwhile, Oscar attacks again and talks about how he doesn't care if he wins or loses. His main desire is to show his full power. The head of the masks raises his sword and says that if Oscar's desire is so high, he will put all his strength into the final blow. Charges of powerful energy begin to appear around. Our hero Oscar realizes that most likely his opponent is not joking at all now. In the moment, the head of the masks appears right in front of Oscar and says that this is the end of it, preparing to deliver a massive blow. Oscar also decides that he should show his strong side and creates a huge charge of energy around him. All the other guys say the fight is picking up a lot of momentum and the wind has picked up a lot around them. In the moment, a strong aura of a god appears, the same god Michael that lurks inside Oscar. Oscar himself at this moment is as if in the hands of some angel who warms him around and does not let him die. In a moment it all comes back together, but the mask leader notices the change. He saw the very aura of the god. In a moment Oscar manages to break through his defenses, immediately after which he pulls out his blade and pulls it back, preparing to strike. Immediately afterward, Oscar picks up a lot of speed and runs straight at his opponent, preparing to deliver a crushing blow. And it works out. Oscar strikes a powerful blow against the leader of the Muskie factions, and it turns out to be a guy named Gene. In the moment, everyone around who was watching the fight with shock notices the fact that Gene's mask was broken by Oscar's punch. At first, Jin tries to cover her face with her hand. However, afterwards she turns to everyone and only apologizes to them. Immediately afterward, Jin gathers enough energy in his hands and seals the gap in his mask. This is all being watched by Oscar, who is greatly surprised that using Jin's energy, he was able to restore his mask. Jin explains to our hero that he has reversed time by a few seconds. Many will not realize it. Only the very strong will notice the change. Oscar thinks it's cheating, but Jin explains that he admits defeat, but wants to continue training other recruits. In response, Oscar talks about how his principles don't allow him to admit this kind of defeat publicly. In return, Gene offers Oscar a rather large amount of money and any favor from him. Oscar realizes that deep down he didn't want to agree to this, but he was offered enough money to keep quiet. Gunnar's aides notice this and communicate with him on the subject of Jin. The general says he's figured it out too, and he accepts Jin's decision. Time moves forward, and the general decides to make a public statement saying that he is disappointed in the recruits. He talks about how out of 300 people, only a few were able to touch members of the Musk group. Next, he announces that training further will take place in just 1 year, half of which will be just physical training for the guys. The general also states with anger that they will keep the fighters in different endurance training throughout this time. Charlie turns to Oscar at this time and asks about why he won't tell everyone about the situation with Gene. Oscar asks Charlie how he knew, and he tells him that using an artifact he was able to record everything and watch it. Oscar tells Charlie that everything that's going on makes him a little uncomfortable because he shouldn't let the new recruits be so inexperienced. Hearing such phrases from Oscar, Charlie was highly motivated and had already begun to envision our hero as a god. Some time passes, the guys return to the dormitory noticing that after only half an hour, it has already been completely rebuilt. Oscar talks about how this is apparently the work of the same guy again, which surprises Charlie. He asks not to speak in riddles. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to a group of masks who are going somewhere tired and unmasked. One of them addresses the captain, talking about how he shouldn't waste his powers like this. Lily intervenes in the dialogue. She immediately asks about their captain losing to Oscar in that fight. Jean immediately talks about how everything is right, and some of the recruits are smart beyond their years and will pass everything with flying colors. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to Jerry, who is running around the field and getting very tired from 50 laps. The general reminds him of his words about 100 laps, whereupon Jerry gets up and immediately starts running forward. Meanwhile, local doctors are taking stock of Charlie's condition, who collapsed after running only 20 laps because of his fat. Meanwhile, the general records the first successful result from Oscar, who was able to run all 100 laps. Immediately afterward, Oscar's attention is diverted by saying that a man has come in who you really want to see him. It turns out to be Jean, who immediately starts discussing everything with Oscar and talks about some kind of contract with a god. Jin tells us that for some reason the gods don't enter the human world directly, but use humans to do so, which is how the contract comes about. Jean explains to Oscar that the point of the contract is that the god gives up some of his power in return for getting some of his wishes. Jin talks about how not everyone can become a messenger of a god and make a contract with them. Our hero is surprised and doesn't remember anything like that. Immediately afterward, Jin reveals that he got the power right before he died when he was almost hit by a car. A god offered him a contract. Immediately afterward, Jin also says that there is most likely some sort of land of the gods. But there is a but. From that point on, the events of the story move forward and take us to Charlie, who in turn peeks in on the girls' training sessions. This angers the general greatly, and he takes Charlie back to his place and tells him that he will forever learn sword technique from him. Immediately afterward, with great anger and energy, the general begins to teach Charlie sword techniques with a wooden example. The general asks Charlie to watch his enemy's actions closely and analyze them, but Charlie only cries out in fear. Immediately afterward, Charlie has his barrier activated supposedly by accident, and he talks about how he's about to turn it off. Immediately afterward, Charlie also begins to pretend as if he accidentally transferred his abilities into attacking the general. However, Charlie fails to hit the general specifically. He apologizes, and the general says Charlie can go. Immediately afterward, the general begins to pay attention to the rest of the guys and notices Lucas among them, who is almost asleep. Immediately afterward, the general addresses him, saying that it's time for them to go for some hands-on sparring, which surprises Lucas. However, all Lucas does in response is ask not to be called out for sparring. He talks about not being able to control himself if he does. But the general doesn't care much for Lucas's words. He asks him to take his sword and start fighting. He agrees, and a dark aura appears. Immediately afterward, an aura of darkness completely envelops Lucas, much to the general trainer's surprise. In the moment, Lucas's eyes are covered in a huge red energy, and the aura behind him only gets stronger. Having enriched himself with such power from all sides, he abruptly snaps out of his seat and heads straight for his opponent with a bolt of energy. Even the general coach, who never expected such a result from him, is shocked by such power. However, the general coach doesn't want to show himself weak and starts defending himself against Lucas's powerful attacks. But it turns out very badly for him, because Lucas's strength is even enough to throw the general aside very powerfully. Immediately afterward, he turns to all the recruits and asks them to leave the battlefield immediately, saying that the battle is no longer a training battle. However, while he was talking about it, Lucas, being without sober consciousness, started attacking him again. Lucas fails to control his anger, and in just a couple of punches, he once again tosses the trainer aside. Immediately afterward, with slow but steady steps, he began walking straight to meet the coach. The coach began to stand up, shaking and asking Lucas to only look in his direction and never touch the rookies. In the moment, Lucas jumps in with an attack right at the coach, but then Charlie shows up and uses the power of his shield. Oscar also appears right after him, jumping right at Lucas and hitting him sharply with his foot. It helps and saves the coach quite a bit from his situation, putting someone like Lucas aside. Oscar asks to be given a sword, saying he can fight Lucas, but coach stands shocked. Immediately afterward, Charlie pulls out a sword and hands it to Oscar. A fight breaks out abruptly between Oscar and Lucas. However, at one point, Oscar uses the power of a god and covers his blade with it, causing a very powerful explosion to happen all around. However, in addition to Oscar's power, Charlie's artifact, which he forgot to remove from his blade before giving it to Oscar, also helped. Oscar himself came to shock from such a powerful explosion. He talks about apparently breaking several of his ribs. However, there is no time to stand and think at all, because at that moment an attack from Lucas flies at him. Oscar turns to Charlie and asks him for more powerful artifacts, but he says he's not sure he has any. But Charlie still finds a small artifact, namely a special magic tape, and gives it to Oscar. Immediately afterward, Oscar heads straight for his opponent and begins to untwist him with that duct tape. This artifact works very well on Lucas and begins to restrain him as he falls to the floor. Meanwhile, the Chief General tells his aide that things are going very inefficiently, and he wants to apply the very same technique. From then on, time marches forward and takes us to the dining hall, where the boys are once again unhappy with the food they have been given. Charlie cries and talks about wanting his home-cooked food. Oscar is surprised at what Charlie says. Although Oscar also dislikes food, he realizes that energy is worth restoring and begins to eat dramatically. However, though Oscar found the strength to eat it, digesting it didn't work, and he started burping that food. In the moment, and already calm, Lucas approaches Oscar. He holds out some good food and offers to share with Oscar. Lucas begins to tell Oscar his story, saying that he once killed a lot of people and is now making amends here. Oscar is surprised and listens intently to his story, then accepts the gift of food and begins to eat. In the moment, the general makes an urgent announcement into the microphone and announces that there are 10 minutes left for food and an unscheduled training session next. Charlie is very surprised and doesn't even know how to react, and our hero Oscar suggests that it's hardly a good thing. Oscar's point is that if the training is going to be outside of camp, it means that the camp conditions don't allow for it, which means the training is harder. The events of the story go forward. All the guys are off to a training session somewhere outdoors in the mountains. The general informs us that our boys will have to cross the mountain in a certain time with a load on them. In the moment, Nami raises her hand and asks the general if this is definitely a normal cross with a load. The general smiles and talks about how he expected such a question from one of the special unit. The general says that she is right, and it will not be so easy, because the participants will be assigned drones that will follow them. The general also says there will be some very interesting punishment for the losers, but our guys aren't too intimidated by that. Immediately afterwards, the general dictates the rules to all recruits, after which he says that the training session can be considered open. Meanwhile, on the very mountain everyone is going to, there is a guy in a robe who puts an umbrella and aura around it, saying no one will get out. Our guys are already in the middle of practice, and Charlie immediately collapses without energy, telling everyone to wait for him. Lucas tells Charlie that he has many artifacts and asks to use some of them. At one point, the guys do stop, deciding to take a break and discuss details amongst themselves. However, in the moment, Lucas asks all the guys to be quiet, mentioning that right above them right now is a drone. Oscar looks at it and analyzes the flight schedule, and then informs them that the drone is flying past them and not to worry. This turns out to be true, because right after he says it, you hear the scream of the guy in front who was hit by that drone. Our guys are watching it in every way possible, noticing that the drone hit it from one time. In the moment, Charlie notices that his suit is starting to speak in a human voice, and Lucas talks about how it's apparently the speakers. It turns out to be a general. He turns and says that very soon they can start carrying out punishments. The events of the story take us to the headquarters, where the officers are interrogating the very guy who was hit by the drone. Through a suit speaker, our guys hear the guy being forced to answer uncomfortable questions and realize they don't want the same. Lucas, Charlie, and Oscar realize they don't want that kind of punishment, which is why they just can't lose. Oscar also talks about how it's not that simple. He adds that HQ uses an artifact that makes you answer everything honestly. In the moment, our hero is approached by Charlie with a creepy aura and talks about how Oscar has to promise him something. Charlie asks Oscar to kill him in case he gets hit by a drone, because he doesn't want to be punished like that. Immediately, Charlie is filled with energy. He instantly stands up and starts urging Oscar and Louise to go faster too. About 12 hours pass, and all the while our guys are still going and going to meet the mountain, not realizing when it will end. In the moment, Oscar stops abruptly and tells the guys that, in his opinion, something is going wrong. Oscar starts looking at the mountains and describes their entire journey, saying that if everything is correct, they should have gotten out a long time ago, but are still in the mountains. Lucas is getting worried. He turns to Oscar and asks about the fact that apparently they are not on the mountain. Oscar begins to look up at the moon and talk about how he is sure that they are on that mountain. However, the position of the moon is not correct at all. Lucas looks at the moon and says the same thing, that it should be closer to the east now, but it's in that position like it's early morning. Charlie starts immediately screaming in panic and talking about how apparently the instructor had apparently used some sort of secret artifact against them. Oscar agrees with Charlie a bit, adding that apparently they didn't originally want the guys to get off the mountain. Oscar says that apparently they want to exhaust everyone involved, and Charlie faints. Lucas again surprised by his behavior. The events of the story take us to Jerry, who with his crew is running somewhere very fast. As it turns out, they are now running from a drone that is chasing them from behind the whole way. In the moment, the drone takes a shot right at Jerry, but his friend decides to save his partner and jumps in to protect him. Immediately afterward, Jerry's partner falls to the floor with no strength and asks his friend to run faster forward and pass the test. Jerry doesn't want to leave because he can't leave his friend, but their third partner says there's no choice. Some more time passes and the staff officer tells them that another man has arrived. Immediately afterward, the officers begin asking him questions one by one, and the answers are broadcast to the entire camp. As it turns out from this guy's answers, he really likes his partner Jerry, an answer that shocks Jerry himself. Immediately afterward, the officers proceed to ask embarrassing questions of him, to which he responds, and it makes our guys laugh. Jerry is pretty pissed at our guys because they are laughing at his partner's answers, so he decides to teach them a lesson. However, their figuring out of their relationship is abruptly interrupted by Charlie's loud shout of a drone above them. At that moment, right after Charlie screams, our hero Oscar abruptly steps right on top of Jerry and kicks him in the back with his foot. Jerry abruptly flies forward and falls to the floor, and exactly where he was standing is hit by a powerful drone shot. Jerry gets up and criticizes Oscar for his action, but the latter says that if it wasn't for his kick, Jerry would have already been out of the game. Right after which, Oscar goes on to say he's just Jerry taking everything around him easier and being smarter. After listening to Oscar, Jerry realizes that he has been acting on the good side and begins to leave with his partner. However, the fact that Oscar is very smart and a messenger of the gods really pisses Jerry off. He gets angry and says he will show everyone his power some more. However, at one point, Jerry's partner drops to the floor and asks his leader to go on without him, saying that the injury at the creek has affected him badly. And much to Jerry's dismay, right at the moment of this dialogue, drones appear from above and fly in their direction. Jerry's partner asks not to worry about him, telling him to let Jerry come to victory on his own. Immediately afterward, Jerry's partner is left under drone shots, and Jerry himself walks forward very disgruntled. Walking through the woods, Jerry assures himself that he must become the strongest and be powerful, and to do so, he should become cold-blooded. Immediately afterward, Jerry's partner asks the drones to eliminate him, but asks them not to ask weird questions, saying that they will embarrass Jerry. However, this hardly seems to bother the drones much, as immediately after his words there is a shot of energy directly at him. However, in a moment, the drone shot was abruptly stopped by Jerry, who was able to do so by holding the weight in his hand. Jerry's partner started talking about how you can't do that because it violates the rules, but Jerry called such rules complete nonsense. Jerry throws his weight right into the drone and talks about how a truly strong man would not be bound by rules. Immediately afterward, there is a huge explosion of energy in the sky, because using a heavy load, Jerry was able to hit the drone. Information about everything that is happening reaches the general himself, who gives the order to release the shells. Upon his order, the special anti-aircraft complex fires upwards several special powerful missiles. Apparently everyone around them notices the rockets flying over them, because it's hard not to notice and hear it. It scares Charlie too. Jerry himself notices that the missiles are approaching and realizes that he needs to act. In the moment, Jerry decides to use the forbidden rune, however. He doesn't make it in time and notices several missiles very close by. Immediately afterward, several very powerful explosions go off in the neighborhood, and Jerry along with his partner are caught. An officer on staff praises Jerry, saying that he proved to be very strong, but broke the rules and broke the drone. The officer prepares to administer the punishment, but another military officer enters the office to report an emergency. A military man tells of a group of recruits being able to find a very interesting object in the woods. As it turns out, Oscar found it with his boys. Charlie asks about what kind of object they found. In response to Charlie's question, Oscar smiles big and says that for themselves, they have found a way out of the ordeal. Oscar tells his partners in confidence that his rune becomes many times stronger at night. Immediately afterward, Oscar reveals that it was Rune's enhancement that allowed him to notice that they were forever going in circles. Charlie talks about how if it was like this, they would have noticed it. But Oscar responds to Charlie by saying that the scenery around them isn't real. Immediately afterward, Lucas turns to Oscar and asks if such a strong ability of Oscar's can help them get out of here. Oscar says it's not that simple, and Charlie adds that even though they know they're going in circles, they can't get out of the circle. Charlie talks about being right and adds that they've managed to find the location of the forbidden artifact, and if they get rid of it, they can get out. Immediately afterward, Oscar extends his hand to his partners, asking them if they will go along with him at the risk of artifact breakage. Lucas and Charlie take turns shaking Oscar's hand and talking about how they would go to the end of the world with him. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to the headquarters, where the military are studying the situation related to the forbidden artifact. The general agrees that this artifact is indeed very dangerous, and adds that we should not forget that new recruits are also dangerous. Immediately afterward, the general gives the order to send all drones and surveillance systems directly in the direction of the umbrella and scoop it up. The general stands up abruptly and says that this training has been done for over 30 years and none of the recruits have yet to pass it. Meanwhile, Lucas is the first to notice all the drones above and talks about how he finds it hard to believe there are so many drones. In the moment, Charlie lunges forward and gets right under the drones, talking about deciding at a critical moment whether you're a coward or a hero. Charlie yells at the drones, talking about being right there, and of course this gets a strong reaction in the form of a bunch of shots from the drones. This leads to the result that was clearly to be expected. Huge blasts just toss Charlie aside. In the moment Oscar realizes what Charlie is up to, he grabs Lucas and starts running forward with him, telling him to take action. Charlie, meanwhile, is very heroically running from the drones from side to side and asking Oscar to hurry up. Using surveillance systems, the military at headquarters immediately realize what is happening and signalize it. The military immediately realized our guy's plan and decided they had to interrupt it and abruptly launched dozens of missiles in their direction. Charlie is the first to notice all the rockets and immediately starts panicking and screaming, saying that he doesn't understand anything. At one point, Charlie gets really tired. He falls to the floor and talks about how he's apparently reached his running limit. Lucas, meanwhile, notices the rockets as well and realizes there's no more time to think of something, so he jumps towards the umbrella. However, right at that moment, a very powerful explosion occurs, the force of which throws everything aside at great speed. The girl at headquarters reports that Lucas was struck by a missile and lost the ability to move. However, in a moment, the sky and moon began to burst and crack like glass, at which point everyone realized that the mirage had begun to shatter. Oscar started looking up at the sky and also realizing that they had probably succeeded and thanking Lucas. Lucas lies on the ground and is greatly relieved at what has happened. He remembers everything up to that moment and lies on the ground with a smile. The general asks not to worry. He says that although the situation is unpleasant, there is still time until midnight. The general orders the surveillance systems to be turned over to the students and tells them that they are still in the mountains and there is little time to descend. However, Oscar didn't think so. He began to climb up using his strength right up the rock, albeit with great difficulty. Meanwhile, the men from headquarters stood on the very rock above, waiting to announce the end of the ordeal by losing. The general looks at his watch and in a moment notices someone's powerful silhouette walking ahead of him. The general, along with his aide, look straight ahead, trying to see who is coming their way. This man turns out to be our hero Oscar, who stops abruptly and salutes the leadership. The general smiles and praises Oscar and talks about how he has performed a miracle that no one has ever been able to do before. From that point on, the events of the story move forward and take us to the dining room where Charlie, along with Oscar, are once again not too happy with the food. The dining hall itself has a strange atmosphere, with all the guys around discussing the fact that Oscar only managed to get out of the ordeal in one piece. What pisses Jerry off the most is that he's as jealous of Oscar as possible, not understanding why all the glory went to him. Lucas praises Oscar, saying he's the first one to complete the workout in so long, even though he made everyone nervous. The events of the story move forward again, with Oscar sitting in some room across from the general, who recalls the incident with Jean's mask. The general praises Oscar and hands over a forbidden artifact in a box and a card with a lot of money from Jean. He also tells us that the headquarters allocated more money because the idea of inviting the masked group was theirs. However, in the moment, our hero Oscar pushes the money card back, saying he won't accept it. Rather abruptly, Oscar declares that he cannot take money from the hands of the military, but only from Jean himself. Immediately afterwards, the military man extends his hand to our hero and says that he is a great young man, and he is clearly not mistaken. However, Oscar does not hurry to remove his hand from the artifact. He says that he does not need the money, but the box will be interesting. Oscar then decides to see what artifact was handed to him. He opens the box and pulls out some blue shard. The military man tells Oscar the great power of this artifact, saying that it was obtained the hard way. Oscar leaves after a while, and the general looks out the window and realizes that he really wasn't wrong about him, because an honest man won't take a warrior's money. The general's aide suggests that even so, giving such a valuable artifact to Oscar was foolish, but the chief disagrees. The general tells his aide that he doesn't understand because a strong wind is about to rise, with Oscar at the epicenter of it. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to Anfisa, with Luis sitting next to her, who says that eating with your hands is not allowed. Luis has changed a lot since that time. Now he is busy teaching Anfisa again trivial things. Anfisa turns to Luis and asks when Oscar will check on them already. She also adds that he hasn't been home in a while. Just then, Oscar shows up and greets Anfisa and calls her mom. Anfisa immediately joyfully starts reaching right for Oscar and calling him her favorite son. Luis at this point starts crying hard and complaining that Oscar has no idea how hard it's been for him all this time. In the moment, Luis notices that Anfisa's healing process is almost halfway through. This both pleases and alarms him. Luis describes everything to Oscar, telling him that she just created the illusion of a very ordinary life for her. Oscar thinks about it. Immediately after his reflections, Oscar begins to praise Luis, saying that he is a professional at what he does. Luis takes Oscar out to lunch, and Oscar himself is greatly surprised at how beautifully the table is set and how much food is on it. Eating this delicious meal, Oscar reflects on the fact that resurrecting Luis as an orderly was indeed a good decision. Oscar also notices that Anfisa's love for him has grown even stronger because of his long absence. Looking straight into the face of the beautiful Anfisa, Oscar notices that even over a banal lunch, the progress of the treatment is increasing. Right after they ate, Oscar noticed that the progress of the treatment began to stop. Oscar decides to test his hypothesis. He goes to Luis and talks about him entertaining Anfisa now. Oscar decides that the most effective method would be to perform a little show, and it works. Anfisa really likes it. However, in the moment, Anfisa starts to get sad. She says that she has so many children, but in the end, she is still lonely. In the moment, Oscar notices that the progress of the cure has reached the halfway point, and he has been given a new ability to choose the powers of the gods. While in his mind, Oscar walks up to a huge roulette wheel and decides to spin it in order for a new power to fall to him. Our hero gets an opportunity, all-consuming darkness, after which everything around him abruptly turns white. Orbs appear above Oscar, telling him that this power allows anything to be covered in darkness and taken over. Already leaving his mind, Oscar notices a warning that Anfisa can now leave the hospital for a while. Oscar returns to his normal life, pretending to be asleep. He ponders the fact that Anfisa could theoretically enter his world. Immediately afterward, Oscar goes to the roof of the building and decides to use the power of darkness to test his strength. Standing right on the roof of the dormitory, little by little, but he's getting the hang of using his new abilities. The events of the story show us a mysterious figure who suggests that Oscar has finally used his awakened powers. Meanwhile, Oscar tests his new abilities right on the roof. Using only energy, he breaks part of the building. Oscar realizes that his condition is rather weak at the moment, but his powers are already enough to move objects. Oscar looks to the sky and realizes that with new powers he can pump up his old ones too, reaching the heights. Immediately afterward, Oscar gets an idea and goes straight to Anfisa, who is very happy to see him. Oscar turns to Anfisa and suggests she go out for a walk, to which she is very much surprised in turn. Anfisa asks Oscar where they can go, and he replies that beyond this world, into the real world. Immediately after, Oscar opens his eyes in reality and realizes that Anfisa isn't around and is a bit even disappointed about it. However, in a moment he hears someone's female voice from behind him. Turning around, he sees Anfisa asking about the place. Oscar tells Anfisa that this is the real world, but she retorts that it is definitely a divine realm. Oscar tells Anfisa that technology rules the world now, and he has changed a lot from the way Anfisa remembers him. Oscar describes the world to Anfisa and talks about how if he could leave the compound, he would show her everything. Anfisa talks about how she doesn't really know what Oscar is talking about, but as long as they are under this sky, she can take him anywhere. Oscar talks about how there are lots of radars and cameras around, but Anfisa asks only to visualize the place in her head, and she'll take it from there. Meanwhile, somewhere in the sky there are airplanes at high speed, which report that a collision of divine energy has been detected. The most important headquarters of the Night Watch immediately determined where so much energy was coming from and reported it to the chapters. The deputy head of the Night Watch requests a report to the commander-in-chief, as well as a full alert. The events of the story, meanwhile, take us to Oscar's aunt, who says she's gotten so old she can't hold the dishes. Oscar's brother helps her and tells her that she'd better rest, and he'll do all the work himself already. As it turns out, Oscar asked Anfisa to send him to his house to watch his aunt and brother. Anfisa turns to Oscar and asks about who these people are and why Oscar is following them so hard. Oscar talks about how this is his family and asks Anfisa to come back, saying that not being at camp for long is just as bad. Meanwhile, Oscar's pet dog starts looking out the window and barking loudly straight up into the sky. Oscar's brother calms their dog, saying that if he barks loudly, he will wake up his aunt. Oscar's brother himself did notice him and was immediately surprised, not understanding why some goddess-like girl was with him. On the roof of the dormitory, where our hero and Anfisa is, an army general comes out and addresses her. He asks Anfisa to introduce herself and she gives her name, adding that she is a great goddess. The general asks Anfisa what brought her to this world and realizes that her aura alone makes him fall off his feet. Anfisa turns to the general and talks about looking for her son, and Oscar intervenes, saying he'll explain everything. In the moment, the general notices Oscar and is very surprised to see him here, asking how he got here. Oscar talks about how it's a very long story, but to summarize, he's that messenger of Anfisa. In the moment, Oscar turns to Anfisa and talks about how it's time for him to go back. She says she has no objection. Anfisa asks Oscar to come more often, immediately after which she, along with her aura, begins to disappear into space. The general immediately relays a message to the army that the goddess has left their world and the alert can be cancelled. Military helicopter pilots say the signal is received and they change their route back. The signal also reaches the main headquarters, where they are greatly surprised that Anfisa has left the world so quickly. The general lights a cigarette and, turning to Oscar, asks about what it was all about and why Anfisa was with him. Oscar summarizes everything, but the general doesn't believe it and makes the point that if Oscar doesn't want to talk, that's okay. Oscar starts to leave, and right before he leaves, the general turns to him and asks about Oscar being on the side of the people. Looking back, Oscar talks about how he made a promise to someone important to him that he would protect people for 10 years. The events of the story take us somewhere in the mountains. Someone's horse-drawn wagon is traveling straight down the water from the mountains. There is some woman sitting in this wagon. She is talking to someone on the phone, adding that she has memorized everything and will pass it on. This girl opens the wagon and tells someone inside that the goddess has already left and there is no point in rushing. Since that moment, the events of history have moved forward. It is already winter, but even in winter, our guys in training camp do sports. The general notices that Charlie complains about everything, for which he adds 10 more laps to him. However, all this does not make Charlie very sad, because he remembers that the new year is very soon. The events of the story take us to a man in a robe. He sits in a chair and talks about the training camp having to go on vacation. The general sits across from this man and says that this is not a joke at all, and you can't treat important things this way. After which the general lights a cigarette and talks about how he won't agree to all this, because it's against the rules. The general turns to the captain and asks about what they're even up to. The captain talks about the huge unrest in the city lately, and he wants to check out the situation with the gods, which worries the general. The events of the story take us to a missile camp hundreds of kilometers away from the main one. Some hooded man is walking towards this camp. He is stopped by local security and asked what is going on. It turns out to be a girl with green hair named Larissa, who talks about how her goats went here on their own. The military man's partner talks about having the alarm lifted, and it's just a villager who got lost. The guards talk about not being able to let the woman inside, and afterward point the way down, telling her to go that way. However, in a moment, Larissa becomes very green, like a monster, and asks the guards if she is beautiful. The guards start yelling for an emergency alarm, but in a moment they just turn to stone. Larissa talks about how the security near this building is tasteless and wrong at all. The general talks about not understanding all this, and the worry, because all the departments under his control are under his control. The captain turns to the general and asks if he can guarantee that there are no traitors among the camp instructors. Upon hearing such a statement, the general abruptly breaks the table and says, is it really the captain's opinion that they have the same problems everywhere? Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to Oscar and Charlie, who are standing in the cold listening to a vacation announcement. One of the military repeats himself by saying that there will be a total of 4 days off for all recruits. All the guys around them start getting really excited and yelling about how this is just great news, only Oscar is not happy. Immediately afterward, the military man compliments his words by saying that no one can leave the city during the vacation and must be safe. Vacations are starting and all of our kids are heading to the train station and to the buses to come home. Oscar makes a big point of pointing out that everyone was given a sword before they went on vacation, and it stresses him out a lot. The events of the story move forward. All the guys got on the bus and started driving home. Many fell asleep, but Oscar is still disturbed by what is happening. Lucas turns to Oscar and talks about how he's too intense as a person on vacation. Oscar replies that that is indeed true. He thinks that these vacations are too unusual. Meanwhile, the events of the story show us the main headquarters that tracks the movement of buses with recruits. An unidentified object is reported nearby. The general says that this is all very strange and orders the object to be shot down. However, these objects are labeled as military, so HQ can't use defenses against them. Meanwhile, at one of the military bases, and really something wrong is happening, because several missiles are flying in the direction of this place. Our guys are just heading to this location and immediately spot the rockets, one of which is approaching the bus. However, at the very last moment, before the missile would have flown into the Atov bus, it is shot down rather abruptly by someone. Although the explosion is quite strong and sharp, it doesn't hit the bus, but it hits it pretty good, which causes a wave of explosions. The guys on the bus are in complete shock. They're trying to grab onto everything they see in order to survive and endure the influx. Our hero Oscar realizes that now, with the help of his power, he can hold back all the shards and save many people from death. Oscar begins to use his powers and reflects dozens of pieces of shrapnel. Meanwhile, the bus flies straight into a tree. Many parts of the bus exploded, but the wave of shrapnel didn't hit our guys as hard as it could have. A girl at headquarters informs the general that someone has arrived on the scene to help and has repelled many attacks. The general talks about how if the dark robe was seen there, it means that Oscar was somehow involved in the defense. Meanwhile, the events of the story take us to Larissa, who sits in the control room and reflects on the fact that everyone around her is very weak. Larissa holds a picture of Oscar in her hands and says that they'll have a lot of work to do with this boy. Since that time, some time passes and our hero Oscar wakes up in some house, not realizing where he is. In a moment, he stands up and turns his head, noticing one of his squad members, and is greatly surprised. Trailing off, Oscar looks up and notices all the other guys from his home squad standing around him. Oscar starts to get up and talk about how he doesn't remember much of everything, and the guys ask him how he's feeling. Oscar is greatly surprised. He says he feels great but doesn't understand at all why he's here.